When I was 10, my parents and I went to visit my grandmother for spring break. My cousin also came to visit, and we decided that we wanted to go to the YMCA for the day. My grandmother dropped us off and said that she would come and pick us up in maybe about 4 hours. On that day, the YMCA was pretty much empty. There were a couple of adults in the exercise room, but that was pretty much it. So we went to the basketball court, and after 2 hours of playing tag and shooting baskets, we were pretty bored. I've never been the biggest fan of swimming, but this YMCA had a pretty cool pool, so we changed into our bathing suits and we headed in there. The pool was empty except for the lifeguard. We played a bunch of games and swam laps, but after about an hour, there wasn't really much left to do, and there was no one except us to hang out with to keep things interesting. So we decided that we would play a game of seeing how long we could hold our breath underwater. We stood in the shallow end near the clock on the wall so we could time ourselves. Instead of fully submerging too, we just sort of stuck our heads face down in the water. We did this a couple of times and I was winning. On our last round, I felt a tap on my shoulder though. I figured that it was my cousin giving up and telling me that I'd won, but instead it was the lifeguard who told me to knock it off or she was going to have to ask us to leave the pool. Since we were tired of being in the pool, we figured that we would get out anyway, get dressed, and we would go back to the basketball court until my grandmother picked us up. We only had 1 hour left anyways, and the water at this point was freezing. As we got out, the lifeguard stopped us and asked if we wanted to go into the sauna to warm up a bit and dry off. The sign said 18 years or older, so of course we were super excited that she allowed us to do that. She walked us to the sauna and unlocked the door. The door was glass and the interior was made entirely out of wood. Inside above the door there was a clock, probably to help make sure that you were not in there for an unsafe amount of time. The lifeguard stand was adjacent to the sauna, but if you looked out the door you could clearly see it. So she followed us in and went over to the thermometer, encased in plastic, and unlocked it so that she could crank up the heat. I figured that she must have to turn it on each time, so I didn't think anything of it. Both my cousin and I were very young and short girls, and so we really couldn't see the temperatures that were printed on the thermometer knob, but I know that she was turning up the heat, that much I'm sure of. Then she left and she shut the door behind her. I thought that I saw her, though, lock the door too, but I thought to myself, why would she lock the door when we might want to get out? I checked the clock and decided that we should get out in maybe 10 or 15 minutes. It was already plenty warm in the sauna, but now the room was blazing, and it felt nice because I was so cold from the pool at first. After about 15 minutes, though, it was starting to get a little bit too hot, and my cousin agreed that we should leave so we can get dressed and all that. I went to turn the doorknob on the door, but it wasn't budging. I thought that maybe it was jammed, so I shook it, but it still wasn't opening, and then I let my cousin try. She couldn't get it open either. We figured the lifeguard would be back in a couple of minutes, so we sat back down and waited. The room was getting hotter now too, and I really wanted to leave. I got up and started banging on the door and shaking and twisting the knob, trying to get the lifeguard's attention. My cousin got up and joined me. We started screaming at the top of our lungs for her to let us out, but she just seemed to stare right ahead. I don't think there's any way that she couldn't have noticed or heard two little girls banging and kicking the door and screaming like that. But now, we had been in there for about 25 minutes. It was now so hot in this sauna that it was hurting to breathe. It felt like my lungs were on fire. My eyes and skin were burning, and we sat back down and put our towels over our heads because they were still a little bit damp and it made it easier to breathe. I was so worried about my cousin as she is a couple of years younger than me, and I looked at the clock and saw that we had been in there for 35 minutes now. I got up and walked to the door again and saw the lifeguard still just staring straight ahead. Again, I tried to get her attention by screaming that we needed out and banging on the door as hard as I could, but still nothing. I was starting to get pretty dizzy at this point, so I went to go and sit back down, but the wooden seats of the sauna burned my skin. My towel was completely dry, so I put it underneath me to sit on. My hair was also dry, but I wrapped it across my face to cover my nose, and I squinted my eyes so that they didn't burn as bad, but I still just couldn't watch if anyone walked past the door or anything. It helped a little bit, I'll admit, but it wasn't great. My cousin was lying face down with the towel over her head, not moving or saying anything, so I nudged her to make sure that she was still okay. She was, but I could tell that she really needed to get out of there soon because she seemed a bit disoriented. It had been about 45 minutes and I was extremely nauseous. There was no way that the lifeguard would forget that we were in there, and I thought that she would have come back soon, but there was this little voice in my head telling me that maybe she purposely locked us in there. Finally, though, a man walked past the door towards the pool, but for some reason I just couldn't get up. My whole body was on fire and I felt so dizzy. Luckily, this man wasn't going to the pool. He, thankfully, wanted to be let into the sauna and came back with the lifeguard. I saw them walking this way and immediately jumped up to grab my cousin. I knew now that for sure that she had locked us in there because she pulled out her keys to unlock the door and let the man in. I didn't want to take any chances of us being trapped in there any longer, so as the man was trying to walk in, I was trying desperately to shove our way out. But as we were trying to get out, the lifeguard started trying to shut the door and push us back with it. The man was clearly confused about what was going on and said, I think they want out. The lifeguard let out a sigh and opened the door fully, and we ran away as fast as we could into the changing room. We only had about 10 minutes before our grandmother was supposed to pick us up now, and we were both so shaken by what had just happened that we didn't say anything to each other as we got dressed or on the car ride home. When we got back to the house, my parents were making us dinner, and I told them the story of what had just happened. They thought that I might have been just exaggerating, and they didn't believe me. I truly think, though, that that woman was going to try and let us cook alive in there. The only bit of doubt that I have is what would have happened if we actually died. She obviously would have gotten the blame, so what was her endgame? I'm 21 now, but I think about this interaction all the time, and when I'm in small spaces or I get too warm, I still have panic attacks. No one that I know really believes this story, and I get it, it's pretty absurd. I'm really not sure if I'm allowed to ask for opinions, but what do you think that this could have been? Do you think it was just some crazy misunderstanding, or do you think that she really just left us in there to die? And if so, why would she do that? Especially when she could get the blame. I wanted to share a personal experience that happened to a whole bunch of campers up at Mariposa County, California from years ago. It was a deaf camp when this happened in the summer, near the end of July. So, something weird, very weird happened here, and I wanted to share this story since it was an old, buried memory that I'd just tucked away. As I said, this is during the summer when it was really hot. The campers all have activities and fun things to do throughout the day, and being up in the woods or the mountain terrain, it gets pretty dark relatively quickly around 6 p.m. or so. The boys and girls have cabins separated by gender, so as the boys we have more of a rugged cabin style, I guess you could say, which is more like a wooded lodge lifted up and surrounded by mosquito mesh, 360, our windows, all around the whole cabin to the one doorway in and out. There's a bunch of these cabins scattered throughout the woods too, some close to each other and some not so much. Anyways, one night, I noticed the cabin not being used off in the distance was just dancing with lights, white and blue, from the inside. I was yelling out about it, but it was a deaf camp, so I had to wave everyone's attention to it, and our cabin staff were wondering what we were all seeing. Pretty soon our whole cabin was getting way too excited, so some of them went to the other active cabins to explain what was going on, and they went out to meet some other staff so as to go and see what was happening at the isolated, unused cabin. It was about maybe 6 to 10 campers per cabins, with about 3 staff in each cabin. There were about 6 cabins active out of 9 total, male side cabins that is. With about 20 staff members, the girls' side staff had seen what was going on and joined under the lamppost that we were there outside of, and basically we all just watched as campers from the meshy open-air cabin windows that wrapped around the structure just watched on. These lights were just sort of swirling around inside, almost in a playful manner. We were watching the whole time. until it just suddenly stopped, and the staff were talking about it and watching from between the cabins the whole time as well, and everyone stopped. Soon they started walking off towards the cabin in pairs of two, and we never saw the lights again, but we were watching them go to the cabins with their flashlights. Soon they started walking into the woods and separated out like it was a sort of search and rescue style operation, with their flashlights scanning the woods ahead of each of the pairs. A few pairs started moving around sort of erratically until everyone looking around ran back to the lamppost and explained what happened, and the staff went back to their cabins to wait for morning. One of my staff said that he saw something twice the size of him, and he's like 6 foot tall, was the color of a sort of white-grey color, and it ran by him so fast that he said that it was just not possible. In other words, it wasn't human. He couldn't make out any features or see any face. He couldn't tell what kind of body it was. He thought that it was like a huge blob or something. Everyone was freaking out by now, and this was happening at around maybe 10:30 or 11 at night. Obviously, nobody really went to sleep that night until morning came, and the people in charge of the camp, or of the deaf camp program, were telling us in the morning that we can no longer go outside of our cabins after dinner. They didn't want anyone to get hurt or anything bad to happen, and people suspected that someone was trespassing, but those of us that saw the lights knew that it wasn't light from a flashlight, since they were literally dancing around like an air show going on inside the cabin. Strangely enough, though, nothing happened ever again after that night, but it was so strange, and the explanation of whatever some of the stuff saw sounded like, I don't know, like the Fresno Nightcrawler to me or something. It was a weird night, and something that I'll never forget. Something that I think about often because, to be honest, I'm just completely puzzled by the whole thing. Some years ago, I took a gap year to travel. This story takes place whilst I was living and working along the Gold Coast of Australia, where I was living in a hostel by a beach. So, late one afternoon, I was in a pretty upset state of mind, and so I decided to go down to the beach to blow off some steam with a walk. I was actually so upset that I hadn't even bothered to put my shoes on, and I had gone down to the beach in my bare feet. I remember walking into the sand and just telling myself, right, I'm just going to walk to this beach one way until there's no more beach left. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I hadn't informed anyone of my plans. I wasn't paying attention to the time. I wasn't thinking clearly at all, to be honest. Looking back now, I'm highly aware of the fact that my going off all alone was extremely unsafe on my part. I mean, I was an 18-year-old woman on the opposite side of the world from her family. I'd left in such a hurry that I didn't even think that I'd taken a phone with me, to be honest. So, I urge anyone reading this to always keep a phone on you at the very least for safety, and to always let loved ones know of your plans, especially if you're within a foreign country and will be going somewhere by yourself. Whilst I know that absolutely anyone can find themselves in danger and that we should always all be aware, I feel the need to stress these points all the more to women. But I digress. So, I walked on and on and on, and I'd taken some decent walks along the beach before, but never this far, never like this. For a while, I wasn't even sure if I was going to make it with any light left, but I ended up hitting the end of the beach just as the sun was setting. I remember gazing at its beauty and missing home terribly, craving for the sun to last. But when it went down and the light was pretty much gone, I faced my long walk home. I walked along the sand for a time, but eventually I strayed from the beach and favored a pathway that ran directly alongside of it. I can't remember exactly what it was that prompted me to do this. However, I know that I didn't plan on sticking to the path the entire way. For one thing, the direction that I was now coming from was not an area that I knew well, and I knew that I was more likely to recognize my whereabouts from the beach once I got closer to my hostel. For another, I remember something that I'd been told by a friend that I'd made when I had first arrived in this area, and it concerned a park that we'd come across whilst on a walk. Although deserted at the time, my friend had told me that the park could actually be pretty sketchy at night, and that certain people tended to do hard drugs there as well. I knew that the park was somewhere within this direction, and so I planned to cut back to the beach long before I ever likely came upon it. Eventually, I reached a part of the pathway where bushes blocked off both the beach to the left of me and the city to the right of me. Feeling rather boxed in and on edge, I sort of hurried along, eager to find a break in the bushes. The pathway was no longer lit at this point, and the darkness had really started to feel suffocating. I told myself not to be afraid, but I was feeling extremely uneasy. I was deeply regretting my decision to do this now, and I just wanted to be back somewhere with light and people. But suddenly, I froze, because there was a figure looming in the darkness, a figure tall and dark. It was so dark that I genuinely didn't see him until he was mere feet away from me, I think. I say him, too, because he was tall with the build of a man. I inhaled sharply. He had his back to me and appeared to be wearing a cloak with the hood pulled up. I stood extremely still, my eyes fixated on this dark back, unable to look away. Had he heard me? Then, slowly, very slowly, he began to turn around. I didn't think that it was possible for my heart to race any faster than it already had, but as I looked into the pitch black hole of the empty hood where this face should have been, I swiftly found out that yes, it was entirely possible. I couldn't breathe now. Despite not being able to make out his face in the darkness, I knew that he was staring straight at me. I could feel it with every ounce of my being. Move, I said to myself. My whole body was on fire with fear. I felt as though I'd been riding on my last inhale for a decade. We stood watching each other in silence. I don't know how long we stood like that, but I said to myself again, move. And something finally kicked in, and I bolted hard. I didn't care about my bare feet. I ran as hard and as fast as I could. There's something about fight or flight that truly does take you to new heights, and I didn't turn around to see if he was following me. I simply kept pushing to get away. I finally made it back to the beach and came across a hotel that I recognized. It was still a little ways away from the hostel, but I desperately needed to sit down, and I wanted for it to just be somewhere safe where there would likely be some form of security, and so I pushed into the pool area and collapsed into a sun chair, shaking. I was still trembling when a kind couple who looked to be in maybe their 50s found me. They comforted me and gave me some fruit from their hotel room, I think, and drove me back to the hostel. I won't ever forget their kindness and generosity too. Now, sometimes I think about the moment that guy turned around and I wonder about his face. I think about that dark hole that I saw. It's wild to think that he's somewhere out in the world being written about now, and despite it being a terrifying encounter at the time, I do hope that if he didn't have sinister intentions, that he's well, or wherever he happens to be. I know that that may be an odd thing to say, but you truly never know what someone's going through, you know? I may have stumbled across him at a pretty dark time, or perhaps there was something more sinister going on. I don't know because I didn't stick around to find out. One thing's for sure though, I don't think that I'll ever forget this encounter because it is now burnt into my brain. So, I have a history of sleep paralysis, but it always happens when I'm on my back. It's usually pretty quiet and serene, I guess, but I sometimes would see an abstract human-like figure who was sort of ghost white with long black hair and appeared to be female. It used to creep me out a lot, but I've learned to just keep my eyes closed and fall back asleep. It was a huge comfort once I got a little bit older too and realized that there really was actually nothing threatening about these episodes and that it was basically just a harmless hallucination. I learned to recognize my sleep paralysis and cope with it, so it was no longer a stressor for me. Now, fast forward, and I was in college at this point, living at home with my parents and two of my brothers. I had fallen asleep in the family room, which was sort of like an extra open space that we used as a playroom growing up. My parents' house was built in the 70s, and At one point, an addition to the house was added by previous owners. That's where our family room is, along with an additional bedroom in the back corner and the laundry room too. And I had fallen asleep on the couch back there. It faced the entrance of the family room, and from here you could see the kitchen and part of the living room. I was having a perfectly normal dream when suddenly the dream was sort of abruptly changed. Metaphorically, it felt like I had been casually watching cartoons when sort of like a broadcast alert interrupted the program to bring the viewers terrible news. I don't remember much about the dream, just a few details like, well, one, it was Christmas. The lights were off, but the Christmas tree illuminated things enough to see. 2, it was a different house, yet the view from my sleeping position could sort of overlay the view of the dream perfectly, if that makes sense. Like, the layout of the dream was built upon what my sleeping eyes were looking at in real life. 3, there was a very unhappy or angry little boy. He was very small for his age and skinny. His head was too large for his body, and he was wearing a helmet of sorts. I got the impression that maybe he was sickly and was wearing the helmet for medical reasons or something. Then, in real life, I was awakened by the entire house shaking. Now, I don't live in a place that has earthquakes, so this immediately freaked me out. It was insanely loud too. I could hear the windows rattling and could feel everything rumbling around me. I was unable to move again. The room was dark, but I think there was a weird sort of green glow. I kept hoping that someone would come and get me and save me. And now this part might sound a little bit insane and dumb, I know, but please bear with me. The fear that I felt was very real at seeing something like this that I couldn't explain. There was some kind of monster right in front of me, and it looked like a tangle of limbs and had no face. I felt like it wanted to hurt me, and I was extremely threatened by it. I remember thinking like, is this actually happening? How am I going to explain this to anybody? I was completely panicked at this point too, but still couldn't move. It's the worst fear that I'd ever felt in my life, in fact, and I don't remember what happened after that, just that at some point I was able to break free and I ran to the bedroom that was back here with me, and my dad was sleeping in there and he was the closest person in the house. I woke him up bawling like a baby and trying to explain what just happened. I think that my family thought that I was having a mental breakdown when we all went over it again the next day. And, to be honest, I still have no real explanation for that night. Like I said before, I know my body and I know my sleep paralysis episodes, but this felt like something different. I was on my stomach when it happened too, not my back. I also distinctly felt like a foreign presence had entered the room that night and terrorized me. This wasn't just my brain this time, I think, and this was something else entirely. It's never happened again since then too, but my family and friends all agreed that this edition of the house never felt quite right, especially at night. After this, I decided never to sleep back there again and have been fine ever since then. Whenever we do have guests, they always feel anxious sleeping back there, and some have reported having unusual or sort of disturbing dreams when sleeping back there. Now, I'm not usually quick to believe in paranormal explanations for stuff like this, but there is a small detail that is likely unrelated, but I thought that it would be interesting to mention. A few years later, once all the kids moved out, my mum started remodeling the house at one point. They knocked a wall down, and inside was a mummified kitten alongside of a vintage black and white photo of a girl. It freaked the contractor out, and they decided to throw it away, but my brother sent me a picture of it before doing so. It's the front and back of the photo, and also I don't have the photo of the poor kitten for obvious reasons, and even if I did, I wouldn't feel comfortable sharing it. I love animals, and especially cats, so I was very saddened when I heard about it being found that way. I can only hope that it had a natural and peaceful passing and that it wasn't, abused in any way, but finding it there in the wall like that? I don't know. That seems pretty sketchy. I still get teary-eyed, though, when remembering this incident due to how confusing and scary it was for me, and also just how sudden and unexpected it was. So me and a friend were invited to a house party just for college students in the richer area of the town that we lived in. So the house was huge with like an acre of land and a pool area and everything. This party was themed to be a little bit naughty, so my friend dressed in a sexy nurse outfit and I dressed as a belly dancer. Majority of the party took place in the house, as there was maybe like 70 people within the house, being very spacious, so not too difficult to get around in. I'm not much of a drinker, but I did have some juice that was available. Some friends pulled me and my friend over to take some pics, and I set my drink down at one point. After what felt like an hour of just taking pictures, I found my cup and took another sip, not even worrying that I left my cup alone for just a moment. But then a man came up to me who looked to be in his late 20s, maybe early 30s. He said my boyfriend's name and said that he's been trying to call me. That's when I realized that I didn't have my phone on me. I have loads of respect for my boyfriend. We always make sure to stay in contact with each other, and since he had to work, I promised that I would contact him, but I had just forgotten. The man said that it was urgent and said that I can use his phone to call in one of the rooms if I'd like. So not thinking at all, I followed the man. If my boyfriend really wanted to call me though, then I knew that it would be something terrible. But as we entered the room, I felt as if I just ran a mile and felt winded all of a sudden. The man closed the door behind me and sat me on the bed and gave me his phone. I started to feel more weak all of a sudden though, like I just got a migraine and just couldn't call. Then I was helped to lay down within seconds, and suddenly I was just out cold. I woke up later not sure where I was or whatever happened. I found my friend rubbing a napkin on my tummy while yelling. It took me a bit to come back to reality, and I realized that I was in a bedroom with my friend cleaning some stuff off of me. That's when I had a panic attack and just realized that I quite possibly may have just been used. My friend calmed me down and told me that luckily didn't happen. She explained that she couldn't find me anywhere and assumed that I went to the bathroom, but after like some minutes I still didn't show, and so she went looking for me and eventually checking the bedrooms and found me laying in bed with this guy and doing or taking something out of my belly button. Apparently he was playing shots with my unconscious body of sucking alcohol out of my belly button. I know, that's really weird, but apparently he was licking salt from my chest and kissing my lips, and she didn't know how long this went on for, but I immediately felt sick and even coughed up from just the thought of it all. Thankfully, my boyfriend got off work early after my friend told him what had happened. He picked me up while my friend asked around about the guy, but of course, no one knew of him or recognized him. I was taken to urgent care and looked at, and thankfully nothing was wrong with me, and the drug in my drink didn't cause any further harm than just knocking me out. I do wish that the story ended here too, but I then started to receive texts from a random guy. At first he was just asking me random things and I just didn't reply, but then he showed me a pic of my torso and started saying creepy things to me, and even giving me the impression that he may be stalking me. This is still going on today, just texting me randomly, and I've had the idea to try and bait him one of these days to finally have backup to catch him, but I don't know how smart that he could be and what he'll do to me if things really don't go as planned. In about 2007, I had turned 13 and my parents began letting me watch my younger two brothers, ages 10 and 8 at that time. We were allowed to play outside, in the backyard mostly, but we had a long driveway that extended to the front gate facing street that we often used to race each other on toy cars and sitting on skateboards, etc. Our street was on a cul-de-sac, with our house closer to the dead end, so most traffic that came down the street was pretty recognizable immediately. One midweek summer afternoon, though, we were racing up and down the driveway with closed front gate, when I noticed a 6-foot-tall white man with black sunglasses slowly driving by and sticking his head out the window to sort of stare at us with a large grin. My first thought was that he must have been a relative. I didn't recognize him because he looked happy to see us, but then as he drove back around, my instincts started to freak out because his car was slowing down, and I realized that I didn't actually know this man. I quickly told my younger brothers to go inside, and we all went through the back door, which I quickly locked. Then we all stood quiet and hid. I peeked out from our large front windows that only were protected by white curtains, and the man had parked his car across the street and was standing by his car, looking back and forth up and down the street. Don't judge me too, but I remember feeling bad for him because he looked lost or like his car just broke down or something. My middle brother was also peeking out the window with me as we told our youngest to just stay in the opposite side of the house, but keep the TV off and stay silent. He stood out there for maybe about 5 minutes, just moving things around in his back seat and trunk. But my sympathy turned into fear when the man started walking from across the street towards our house. I quickly went into the doorway and we laid on the floor hoping that he wouldn't see us at low level through the curtain, that is. He rang the doorbell 3 times and kept trying to look in. I remember feeling frozen, but still being naive, debating if I should just see if he was okay or find out what he wanted. He said hello 2 times and looked really frustrated, which kept on making me feel bad for him, I guess. He rang the doorbell 3 more times, stood there, and finally just left. He was dressed in a nice dress shirt and pants and didn't look homeless or anything, which is why I kept thinking that his car malfunctioned, but as soon as my parents came home that night and we told them what happened, they put locks on the gate and added a security camera. I think what scares me the most, though, as an adult now, is just how close I was to opening that door for him, and the endless possibilities of what that could have meant. Had he been watching our house before and seen 3 young boys? Did he just need car help? This was right before cell phones were everywhere, and I never saw this person ever again, so I doubt it was a relative, and I grew up in a suburb where entire cul-de-sac is Asian or Hispanic, and so this man definitely stood out. But it still freaks me out to think about it. Mostly, too, just how excited he smiled when he first saw us. Anyways, I just wanted to share this story and just tell all the parents out there to be careful. One spring night when I was around 13, I was playing in my garden with a friend. I lived in a small bungalow with an overwhelmingly large garden, large enough to house a World War II era bomb shelter with a lot of space left over too. And toward the far back of the garden there were trees, bushes, and a tall metal fence backing onto the opposite neighbor's garden. It was pitch black around 10 p.m. when I was messing around with a friend in the garden. This part of the garden is far enough away from the bungalow that any light radiating wouldn't illuminate the area. So I turned and looked towards the back, and I saw someone standing there, about 15 feet away from me, standing, I would guess 7 feet tall, but black as anything that I'd ever seen. It was the shape of a person, but something immediately felt off about it. It was so black that it was almost radiating darkness. It's hard to explain exactly what I mean by that, but it wasn't black like a smoky apparition, but completely solid and so much darker than the night around me. It was that dark, in fact, that I felt like I could reach out and physically touch it. It wasn't in my peripheral vision or anything too, but I was staring directly at it. What I mean is that it wasn't a dream or a vision with my eyes closed, or briefly in the corner of my eye or anything. It was right in front of me. Immediately, too, I felt intensely fearful, but I'm not sure if that's because I was generally creeped out or because it was malignant. I quickly grabbed my friend who was next to me and ran inside as fast as I could. My friend didn't see the same apparition as me, but he saw what he described as shapes in the air right around the tree where I saw this person. Our parents immediately investigated because they thought that somebody might have broken in, but when they did, they found nothing. It would be impossible for someone to break into our garden anyway. But afterwards, I just had this constant feeling of always being watched until we moved out of that house about a year later. I'm 27 now and I still think about this. I don't suffer from hallucinations, sleep paralysis. I don't really believe in the paranormal or think ghosts are real. I'm very skeptical and I have a bachelor's of science in psychology, but I know that I saw something real that day that I just cannot explain. And the fact that my friend saw shapes, or whatever that means, suggested to me that I did indeed witness something strange and didn't suffer from a minute worthy of insanity or something. But I am wondering if anybody else has had any similar experiences to this, and do you know what they are? If you do, I would love to be in contact. So, for the last 3 years, I have been dealing with something that watches me while I'm sleeping. It all started not long after I moved into a new home. In the early days, it never seemed to show itself. I would just get a sort of feeling of being watched any time that I went near my bedroom window. It didn't really bother me back then, as I just wrote it off as being paranoid. But after about a year, I start to see something in the corner of my eye, but it would dart off onto the roof as soon as I would look at it. I'll describe it to the best of my ability, since I've never gotten a real good look at this thing. It has pale whitish blue skin, so skinny that you can see its bones, and has bright white pupilless eyes. I eventually got rid of it by placing salt in front of my window, and that got rid of it for about a year, I think. However, when it returned, it came back, and it came back stronger than before. I would start to hear a little girl's voice calling my name as I would try to fall asleep sometimes. Though I'm not sure if this was connected to this thing or something else, but as well as this, I would hear whispering in my ears and scratching at my bedroom door. I don't own any animals, too. Not long after this, a human face, I would see it in my window when I woke up. The man that I saw was wearing a black cloak of sorts, and he had a very sort of cultist look about him. But the part that freaked me out the most was that when I looked at it, it just stared straight at me and would turn its head slightly. Once I would recover from the shock, I would book it downstairs and I would hide in the basement. When I came back up the stairs, it was gone. The next night, the same thing happened, except that it was sort of like half goat, half man, and its fur was all jet black, and it looked like it was muttering something under its breath. I've only seen one other thing in the time since then, and that was a shadow through the curtains while I was showering, but it disappeared instantly when I opened the curtains. If anyone has had similar experiences or has any idea of what this might be and what I'm dealing with, I would greatly appreciate you reaching out to me because, to be honest, I am terrified. So I worked at a boarding facility for dogs and cats, and all I can say about that place is from day one, stuff was just off. The first thing that I noticed weird was that I would hear a voice right behind me, and when I turned around, there was no one ever there. Understandable enough, I mean, with 20 to 70 dogs barking all around me for their lunch or playtime or potty breaks, it was bound to happen. And so I kept discarding these things. Until one day, from on top of a low kennel, a partially filled water container, like the ones that you use to water plants with, and we used to fill the water bowls too, flew at me. And there was no way that a dog would have hit it like that and sent it somehow flying horizontally at me. It missed me by an inch or so, and I felt the breeze of it flying past me as I walked by. It hit the kennel across from where it was located really hard, and I just stood there dumbfounded. I knew that something was up then, but still hadn't paid it much mind. Shortly after, I noticed the metal doggy doors that lead from each kennel into an outside run. They would start swinging when I entered the kennel to clean it, or for anything really. I would look at the doggy doors, okay both other sides, no motion from them. If I stepped out of the kennel though, the door would just stop swinging. And well, if this was all it was, then there was nothing new for me to experience weird stuff like this. So what, right? One more story of something weird to add to the list. But one day a co-worker got mad at me and called me. She said that she saw me through the window and asked why I didn't go back and talk with her for a bit. I answered with the fact that I wasn't, nor had I been anywhere near work that day. She thought that I was kidding and went to the front desk to ask, and was told that nobody, in fact, had been through at all for the past couple of hours. This happened 3 times with 3 different co-workers too, where they would see me from another room or yard or something and asked why I never stopped to talk to them, on days that I wasn't even at work. This eventually progressed too, and I was moved up to being the bather for our location, so a lot of dog baths and loud dryers going for the pups. And I kept seeing, every time that I was bathing a dog, my manager and then friend, and also the person whose voice that I heard the most when no one was there with me, standing by my side. She would just stand there waiting for me to turn around and turn off the dryer so that I could see her, and once I did and turned towards her, nobody was ever there. I checked a few times too, and she would always be busy with clients or not even in the building. At this point, some of us girls had already been discussing the weird stuff going on. One friend and I, roughly at the same time, said, "Oh, the mimic or the imitator or whatever," and we looked at each other and sort of smiled nervously. We'd never talked in depth about this stuff because, come on, right? It's weird. Plus, how many people would have taken us seriously anyway? But it turns out that 2 other girls had heard or seen me or the manager more than once when we weren't even there, and it just wasn't us. 2 more things to stick in my memory about this place. 1, we had a storm which led to power flickering on and off. From reception to the back kennel area, where most of the activity seemed to happen, was visible through a large window so clients could see where their fur babies would be kept. As the lights flickered, 3 of us stood in reception past our shift in case we had an emergency. 2 of us were facing that window, and both of us at the same time saw a fast, non-identifiable shadow thing rush past the window even higher than the top of the kennel doors, which, by the way, are like 6 feet tall. We saw this twice during the light flickers too. The second thing that stuck was this. We had these sort of radios, I guess you could call them. We just often forgot to use them or even turn them on. One of my co-workers was outside with the daycare dogs. Dogs were there to just play for the day, when her radio clicked and a voice she didn't recognize said, "Spot's mum is here for the pickup," and cut out. She went to answer, only to realize that her radio wasn't even on at the time. She got that dog ready and took him to the front, where the receptionist said that she didn't call for him. She didn't have any radios on either. We still don't know what it is or what we experienced there, but we do know that it was definitely out of the ordinary. So I've heard this sort of story so many times, but honestly, I never thought that it would happen to me. So last night I was doing some Christmas shopping alone at a local TJ Maxx. I, 35 female, rarely ever go shopping alone, especially in the evening. Usually I have my kids or my husband with me. But I'm browsing around aimlessly, kind of just all over the store, not sure what I'm going to get. I see this young guy, probably early 20s I would guess, skinny with glasses. I don't really think anything of it. I went to a different spot and I see him again. He's in the same aisle picking stuff up to look at and putting it back. No cart or anything, mind you. My red flags were definitely not raised yet, but it was odd for sure. Then I see him a third time in a different area, doing the same thing, but now stopping and texting someone. My senses started to perk up a little bit at that, like, okay, this is a bit weird, but I'm not nervous yet per se. But I definitely am more aware, I guess. But then it happens again, and this time I know something is weird. He's definitely following me all over the store and has nothing to buy. So I just start kind of zigzagging through the store and I find a coat that I want to try on. At this point I was very wary, but also thinking that I'm being ridiculous and paranoid. But I just had this strong sense that this was not normal. I went into the dressing room for about 15 minutes hoping that I would lose him. I came out and didn't see him for another 20-ish minutes. I was relieved, thinking that I was definitely being paranoid and he probably left. I go to the checkout after almost an hour and a half of shopping with a cart full of stuff. I was the only one in line. I get called to the cash out, and I turn around and this man is immediately behind me in the checkout. He just came out of nowhere, and he had one item, so cheap, like a little decoration or something, and at this point, I was full on panicking. The cashier could tell that I was being weird and very distracted, and at the risk of sounding crazy, I almost didn't say anything, but I told her that I think that this man is following me. She was extremely empathetic and did not seem very surprised. She was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'll have someone walk you to your car if you'd like." I was really thankful for her kindness too. The man checked out with his one item and left the store with an older man who I hadn't seen before. The older man had nothing that he had bought either. The parking lot at this store is a huge dark plaza as well, and I did not want to go outside alone. I just knew that it was a very bad idea. The cashier asked another employee to walk me out, and she was younger than me but really sweet. I apologized profusely because it was sleeting and cold rain and she had no coat on. She said, "I don't care if it's downpouring. I would still walk you to your car." It was really sweet, really, and she walked me all the way and even waited until I pulled out and drove away. Mind you, the whole time I was shaking like a leaf, but like I said, I've heard this happen to so many women, but I kind of thought that I might just be being paranoid or exaggerating the whole thing. It was extremely scary though, but the more I think about it, the creepier it gets. Because he followed me around the entire store, and everywhere I turned, there he was. I have no idea what his deal was, but it was really unsettling. My husband freaked out too and really doesn't want me to go shopping alone anymore. To be honest, I really don't want to shop alone anymore either. If I had not been paying attention or dismissed my bad feelings, I really do think that something bad would have happened that day. As a woman too, being aware of our surroundings is really important because you just never know if something like this might happen. At one point a few years back, I ended up working in a small privately owned restaurant. It was set on a small main drag in a tiny historic community. The restaurant definitely stood out too amongst the locals and the tourists due to its multicultural food variety. The restaurant served everything from American cuisine to Indian, Thai, French, and Middle Eastern foods too. The small restaurant was formerly a popular privately owned Chinese restaurant and a local favorite, but unfortunately the older man that owned and operated it passed away inside the restaurant one day. So suffice it to say that the local townsfolk didn't take too kindly to the foreign city woman that bustled in shortly after his death and purchased his restaurant. Not only was my former boss flaky and irresponsible, but she could also come off as quite curt and rude at times. So she had a rough go at first obtaining the proper permits and whatnot in order to renovate the historic building. The thing is that when you do certain renovations in an old building like that, the local law requires you to then update a lot of other things that could be very costly. So that meant that she decided to just use the staff that she'd hired, which was us, to help her with most of the renovation work. Everything was going pretty smooth too, like nothing out of the ordinary. That is, until one overcast drizzly day when we're all sort of gathered in the dining area for a staff meeting. As we all sat there quietly listening to the boss lady, something a little strange happened. The front entrance door to the restaurant suddenly opened to about halfway and then carefully closed after a second as though someone had simply stepped in. Of course, there was no one there as the door was almost entirely glass and we would have seen a person on the other side, but we all sort of looked at each other confused. But we just chalked it up to being the breeze since the back area door was open, though there was a set of closed kitchen doors in between, so it really didn't make much sense. Anyway, the second odd thing to happened to another employee when she was there alone one night. According to her, just after she turned a corner passing a shelf with some tools on it, an empty cordless drill case went flying past her head. It barely missed her and smashed into the wall in front of her. She definitely seemed pretty put off when she told us about it in the kitchen the next day. But following that, Random small things would happen here and there. Like our boss would ask us once in a while why one of us didn't come into her office when she'd seen one of us walk by her open door, but we were usually puzzled by that, as none of us had ever walked past her office during that time. But besides that, we'd get the occasional strange sound, I guess, like a faint voice or a door opening or closing. Also, when I'd be in the kitchen putting together some ingredients for a recipe and I'd have to walk away for a second to go and grab another ingredient off the back shelf or something, but then I'd return less than like 15 seconds later, when one of the ingredients that I'd sent out prior to leaving the area would be just gone. I'd end up having to measure out and prepare the same ingredient again, annoyed, and I never did find out where all that stuff went. But I had no idea that it was about to get a whole lot more terrifying for me personally. You see, the final thing to happen to me and my co-workers was the worst experience that I'd ever had. That was paranormal, hands down. But in order to properly explain this part to you, I sort of have to explain a couple of things about the restaurant kitchens to you, so bear with me. So in a typical restaurant kitchen setup, you have a cook line. And the cook line is, well, literally that. A line as in skinny walking or standing space, typically between the oven, fryers, and the cooktop, with the prep surfaces and small fridges on the opposite side, leaving about maybe 3 to 4 feet or walking aisle forming a cook line. Besides that, there's a dishwasher outside of that line, followed by the rest of what you'd expect to find in a restaurant kitchen. You know, like fridges, freezers, all on a large scale too. You also have your giant hood fans above the cook area, and a hot water heater too. The reason why I point all of this out is because together, they all constantly make noise. Think like louder ambient background noise constantly. So, this one day, there are 3 of us working in the kitchen. Me, my boss, and another employee on the dishwasher. My boss and I were on the cook line, while the dishwasher was a few feet away from the cook line, and we were all 3 working as normal when all of a sudden it just got really quiet. Think of when you don't realize you'd been hearing a sort of constant low sound until it suddenly stops and then you notice the sudden change in the noise environment. This was like that. Except for, it absolutely got dead silent. Almost like an invisible soundproof blanket got thrown over the 3 of us. And as soon as I noticed it, I looked around at the other 2 and they also looked puzzled. Well, what the heck, I questioned out loud. Why is it so quiet all of a sudden? I asked the dishwasher guy suspiciously and he said, I don't know. My boss replied the same thing too, drawing out her words nervously as well. She turned to face me as I was standing directly behind her in the narrow cook line. Hey, Nora, go make sure that the fridges and the hood fans are still running. Maybe the power's out. So I ventured the 10 or so feet to outside the cook line area and, weirdly enough, suddenly I could hear the hood fans and even the dishwasher, hot water heater and all the fridges and freezers running like normal. I went back to my boss and, with a sort of confused look, told her everything's working fine. That was the first creepy part of that, but when I stepped back onto the cook line to tell my boss, everything went silent again. Well, Nora, get back to work grilling those peppers, I guess, she snapped. So I got back into the cook line beside her. After a couple of minutes, though, I suddenly started to get tunnel vision and I felt really dizzy and nauseous. I told my boss and she told me to go and sit out back for a few minutes and get some fresh air, which I promptly did. As I was sitting outside trying to feel better, I could see my boss go into her office, which was kitty corner from the back door. Since the back door was open with just the screen door closed, I was able to hear her while she made a phone call. But she sounded urgent and shaky as she asked the person on the other end of the line to please bring an abalone shell, some sage, and some kind of weird oil. Now, the reason that she needed those particular items was because, according to her, she had felt something walk through her on the cook line that wasn't good. And the terrible part is that I was standing right behind her, inches away on that cook line. I waited for her to finish her phone call and return to the cook line before I went back in. By the time that I got back, everything sounded normal again on the cook line, which was just so bizarre. When I got off my shift about maybe an hour later, believe me when I say that I made the normally 45-minute drive home in just under 30 minutes. All night that night, I tossed and turned, unable to really sleep, but the few times that I managed to slip into sleep, I kid you not, I got jolted right back awake because I would see a screaming demon-like thing right in my face every time that I fell asleep. I still don't know if that's related, or maybe it was the adrenaline in my body that was keeping me awake with bad thoughts or something, but whatever it was, that day has got to be one of the weirdest experiences that I have ever had. When I was like 16 or so, I'm now 24, female from England, I was sat in my conservatory on the phone to a friend. My conservatory looks out onto my decking, which is followed by my garden. My mum was out in the garden hanging the washing out, and my dad was sat gardening slightly further up. I could see them both. On my decking, we have a large wooden table and a bench set for sort of hosting outside with. You can see through the wood of the benches as there are gaps between the panels. And now, this next part makes me sound so crazy, but I know that I saw it, and I just cannot explain it, and it drives me nuts. So when I got off the phone with my friend, I saw an extremely pale, disembodied hand pop up from behind the top of the back bench. It just shot up, fingers spread wide, kind of like jazz hands, I guess. It then started frantically waving at me and then put its index finger into a point gesture and started rotating its wrist really fast, and then would point left and right and then back to a wave. The whole ordeal lasted about maybe 10 seconds, and I must have blinked and then it was gone. I could see though that there was no one there, and I sat in complete shock for about a minute, wondering what the heck I just saw. My parents, who were busy, were also oblivious to this happening. I walked out to the garden soon after. I was so on edge and mouth wide open and stuff, and mentioned it to my mum, who I think just thought that I was making things up. I'm really not sure, but I've mentioned it since, and the more I've spoken about it, the more I think that she believes me, because what a random and specific thing to lie about, right? I didn't even bother telling my dad because I knew that he wouldn't believe me for a second. But I think about this situation regularly and have moments where I question if this was just my imagination, as it really just makes zero sense. Plus, nothing has happened to me like this before or after this event too. Somehow though, I know deep down that I saw this disembodied hand as clear as day, and I'm wondering if anybody else has had any similar experiences. Do let me know too, so that I can feel slightly less insane than I already do. I live in a pretty small rural village in Germany. Less than 200 people live here. Not much around here too, besides fields, forest, cows, sheep, a donkey and maybe 2 horses. But directly outside of the house that I live in is a road to the right which leads into a field, and then into a pretty thick forest. The route that I usually take is around maybe 18 kilometers long, or 11 miles for the US listeners. I'll simply stick to miles to keep it simple too, but it doesn't sound like much, but the route is very rough. It's uphill almost the entire time, and the forest has no roads, so you actually walk through rough terrain with thick tree roots and bushes, etc. Anyway, I walk this exact route 1 to 2 times per week, and usually when it's already dark outside. I wear a headlamp for when it's too cloudy out and the moon isn't nicely visible, so I don't trip or get hurt. Why at evening or nighttime, you ask? Because I'm usually on the phone with a good friend talking, and we live very far apart. It's day for her when it's night for me, and I don't mind because that way I just don't feel alone hiking. Also, here's a bit of an information dump because it's pretty important. For people who are not familiar with German forests, the most dangerous thing that you may encounter is a wild boar, so it's usually pretty safe to just wander around. There's almost no wolves where I'm at, and even if, they would be way too shy to just show themselves. Bears are not a thing here. Also, no crazy people living inside the forest too. The only thing that you really encounter is the farmer, who drives up like 1 to 2 miles into the road to check out on the livestock. And after that, it's all forests, no fields anymore anyway. So, headlamp on, AirPods in, talking to my friend, catching up. For the first 5 miles or so, nothing weird happened. I even had the headlamp off, and though I wore it on my head, the moon was making enough light, and once your eyes sort of adjusted to the dark, you could see quite well. As long as you don't sprint around the forest, you should be okay. Though, once I was in the deeper part of the forest, my AirPods started making weird sounds, almost like I was losing connection or something. But I could hear her voice still, and it was more like a background buzzing, I guess. It wasn't actually interfering with my call or anything, but this buzzing went on, and after about 20 minutes or so, I suddenly noticed that I couldn't really see as well anymore as I was able to just moments ago. The moon seemed to be blocked by clouds or something, but these clouds didn't look like normal clouds. They sort of looked like thick walls of fog, just way higher than the fog should be. I know it's hard to picture, but clouds usually look fluffy or thinned out. These seemed heavy and almost wet. It's hard to describe, but I told my friend to hold on for a minute because I had to focus on something. I don't know why I said that, but focusing on her talk was disrupting my view, I guess, for whatever reason. Sensory overload, I guess. But the thing that I had to focus on was a huge, thick, deep black cloud. It kind of pushed itself through the fog like clouds and positioned itself right over me, almost as if it was trying to throw a shadow around an area that I was in. Then, the cloud also started to swirl in the middle slightly, and that was when my connection just fell flat. I got the beeping sounds that you get when you lose connection, and my phone call was now gone. No more bars and no more data, nothing. But my AirPods were still buzzing like crazy in my ears. That was when I felt uneasy, neck hair standing up, cold sweats on my back, and I started turning around to leave because the way ahead just seemed a lot more dark and sinister than my way back. And the moment that I turned around and started, well, slightly jogging back because I felt scared, was when I started to hear what I can only describe as like bell sounds. Almost like church bells, but the sound was deeper. That sort of typical ring that you hear after a bell sound was just struck in the air, and it was giving me this weird sensation as if my bones were suddenly rubbing up against each other. It was extremely freaky, and all I remember is that I started to go from walking back to jogging back to running back, trying to leave the forest and go back to the fields where you start this journey. I didn't look back while running, but I could hear the bell sound getting weaker the further away that I got, and the fog-like clouds that I saw before were becoming less and less until I finally left the forest and I was back to a normal sky, thin clouds and the moon. Once I got back home, I simply undressed, went into the shower, and after that, I went to bed, thinking that I was just simply spooked or something today, or maybe I was just exhausted and my brain went haywire or something. I let it go. But I don't know. I never saw a cloud like that in my life, and the church bells are not a thing late at night inside an abandoned forest like this too. I never went back to hike that route again, and I never told anyone because, well, it's pretty embarrassing to share something like this, right? But I had to think of it today, and I thought that I would share it in the hope that maybe someone can tell me what this is. About 3 years ago, I was 38 weeks pregnant. My husband and I, we lived in what we called our village, and it was basically 2 dead-end streets off of a highway with forests beyond the streets, at the end of them that is, and a small local store at the corner of one street. We called it the village because our trailer park neighbours were my aunt, uncle and cousin's trailer, and then my husband's brother and nieces. Then my grandma's house was on the next street over. My other aunt, uncle and cousins lived with her at the time as well, and my husband and I were 21 then. So my best friend Ray was visiting from college and had spent the night with me. The next day, we decided to walk up my street, down the highway past the store, then down by my grandma's street and back through the woods to my house. This was to try to help to get labor started, as my pregnant belly was huge at that point and my back hurt often. We were talking while I sort of hobbled with her down the highway when a white truck rode by rather slowly. I knew the speed limit was 55 and this dude had to be going like 30. Through the driver's window, I saw a bald white man, maybe in his 50s, sort of rubbernecking at us. At this time it looked like there might have been someone else in the passenger seat too. The truck was kind of old, but I didn't know the year, make or model or see the plate or anything. Ray was talking and unbothered until I said, "Hey, that guy just went by really slow and I don't think that was anyone that I know." She replied with something like, "Oh, I didn't even notice that." We were now halfway to the store as well, and it was less than 2 minutes later when we saw him coming back from the other direction. I said, "Hey, that's him again, get in the grass." Since we were on what would have been the right side, we went down the slope of the grass off the road. We're still in front of the people's houses because the section of the highway is sort of lined with residences between the dead-end streets. He passes us slowly again. When I turn to look behind us, he's slowing down even more, finds a spot and starts to turn the truck around. I told Ray to run, so we ran, and I was doing the best that I could, being super pregnant. We thought about going into the store, but decided to head for my grandma's up the other street instead. Her house was up the hill at the end, but it wasn't a long run by any means. When we got up the hill, I looked back again to see his truck pulling into the store parking lot. We continued to run, got to my grandma's where she and my aunt were sitting at the table and told them what just happened. My aunt made a police report. I was afraid to at first, thinking that maybe I was just being paranoid. I mean, what if it was someone that I knew and they were just trying to say hi and maybe it was just a waste of the police's time. Turns out, though, that there had been other reports of a man creeping around the neighborhoods. Someone in another trailer park down the highway reported that her kids were outside playing when a man emerged from the woods trying to lure one of them to him. They hollered for their mum and supposedly she came out and threatened him, so he ran off. But it continues. You see, a few more times we think that we see this truck, but we're not sure if it's him since one of the residents also has a white truck too. My family had yet to see the truck, so they couldn't identify it. But at some point when I wasn't home, a few of my cousins were playing outside. Their ages ranged from 10 to 15. And this time, the truck came rolling down our little street past them. He turned around at the end, came back up and stopped next to them. They said that he was apparently trying to lure my 11-year-old cousin to the truck, but he said no and they all ran back to my aunt's house. But we had talked with the children about what was going on in the neighborhood lately, so thankfully they knew what to do. One more thing happened though before the report stopped. I had my baby at 40 weeks and my husband and his friend, the baby, and I were home one day. The baby was about a week old when we got a call from my aunt at my grandma's house that they had seen the man real up close and personal. My 2 female teen cousins were in their room. It was getting dark out, but for some reason my cousin went out to open the blinds to the window and there was the man squatting on the AC unit staring at them. They screamed and he jumped off and ran into the woods behind the house. My aunt called the police. My husband and his friend later went out with guns and flashlights to search for him in the woods, but they didn't find him. I believe that he was parking his truck somewhere and then stalking houses from the forest perhaps, but my husband and I actually used to walk through those woods and never had any issues as it was private land that we had permission to walk on. But it also seems that this man did not have a preference for age or gender or anything. He seemed to be looking for anyone that he could get for whatever sick reason that he had in mind. There had been police sent to patrol the highway or sit on the side of the road waiting since then, keeping an eye out for him throughout those weeks, but they never did catch him. I still wonder sometimes, though, if he was someone from out of town, and I hope maybe somewhere he gets busted before something bad happens. We might never know, but I truly do hope for it. To set the scene, it was November 27th, and I'm walking through the woods to avoid interacting with guests, like the average antisocial teenager that I am. I have one of my uncle's dogs with me, Duke, a 150-pound Great Dane. We were passing through a clearing at the time and taking a walk. I state the size and breed of the dog to demonstrate how out of character his behavior will be too. But as we get about halfway through the clearing, he begins to walk slower and sort of begins to whine a bit. I assume that he must have hurt his paw or something, so I check him over but find nothing. I turn around and in my flashlight beam I can see a pair of eyes about maybe 4 feet off the ground, significantly taller than anything with eye shine in my area. I understandably freak out at this and start to back away a bit. But then the most horrifying thing happens. Whatever it was, it stands up. Whatever was watching me is now over 6 feet tall easily, and then it seemed to talk. It said help, I think, with no emotion or cadence behind it. Duke is losing his mind trying to get away, and I decide that that's a pretty reasonable plan at this point. As we're running through the forest trying to get back to our house, I can hear this thing saying help, help, help over and over again, always with about 5 seconds apart. We eventually make it back to the house and we immediately get inside. For the next few nights, if I looked out my window, I could have sworn that I saw those same eyes gazing back at me from those woods. I don't know what it was. I've heard stories of skinwalkers, wendigos, or whatever it is, but whatever it was, I hope that I never see it again. To answer some questions as well that I'm sure you'll have, this occurred in northern Oklahoma. There was no discernible gender to the voice that I could make out. There was no discernible evidence when I went back the next day as well to have a look around. No footprints and nothing that I could spot anyway. But then again, I am definitely no tracker or anything. So there recently was a thread on Reddit about what made you believe in ghosts, and I'll start with the same context many probably have said before, but I was an extremely skeptical individual. I believe that the majority of events that occur can be explained by logical explanations or something other than the paranormal. That was until both myself and wife had our experiences with several unexplained events. I want to context that these events have changed both my wife and myself's views on many things, including the paranormal. These events took place around maybe 6 years ago now. So my wife and I were staying at my father's house after he passed away. Everybody in the family spoke about the house being haunted as long as I can remember. Personally, I'd never had anything weird happen prior to this, and overall just chalked it up to that side of the family being overzealous storytellers. But we were at the house for around a week to help clean it out, as it was around 6 hours away from where we lived. And there were several weird events leading to the final event that changed myself and wife forever. To give better context, the house itself was a postage stamp-style Victorian house, with 2 floors and a semi-finished apartment-style attic. I was going up into the attic to work on cleaning out some stuff my father had up there. He was an avid collector of NASCAR die-cast, and other collectibles and things were pretty much everywhere. On my way up the steps, I was on my phone with my wife, who had went to get some food, when I saw the handle on the attic door twist and the door slightly open. This area where we're in is not necessarily dangerous, but was far from nice, and I instantly thought that somebody had broken in, and immediately ran up to investigate. I searched everywhere, and I couldn't find anyone. In retrospect, I know it was idiotic to go up there alone, as if someone was up there. I was not prepared to handle it or anything. Grief makes emotions just dull, I guess, including fear. The second event was that my wife, myself, and my childhood friend were in the same attic cleaning out items. In the attic, there was this thick old shag carpet that had been there from like the 70s. Since it was a semi-finished attic, one room was for storage and is where my buddy was working. I look at my wife at some point, who literally just points at the door. And we both watched the door for that room close slowly on my buddy. But there was zero reasoning or explanation for how this happened. as we both saw it, and the door itself took a large amount of force to actually close it. Obviously, my buddy was pretty unhappy, and we both just sort of said sorry, forgot you were in there to avoid him thinking both of us were losing our minds or scare him or something. Now, the last night that we stayed there, we slept on the second floor in the master bedroom. The bedroom itself was positioned so that the headrest of the bed's wall was sort of aligned with a set of chairs coming up. The wall and the stairs were about maybe 3 to 15 feet difference in height, depending on the location, and that's an important piece to what ended up happening too. So throughout the night, my wife kept waking me up to say that someone was walking around on the platform landing outside. I looked and did see what looked like a shadow under the door frame, so I immediately opened the door and braced for what I assumed was an intruder. But again, there was nothing there, even after searching the house extensively. Later that night, I'm awoken to sounds of scratching in the wall behind my head. My wife is already awake and looking at me oddly and sort of terrified as she hears it too. I assume that it's a rat or some type of animal, and while weird that it was directly behind me, it wouldn't be far-fetched to possibly believe that it was just some critters in the house because the house certainly had them. So in a sort of tired rage, I turn around and just punch the wall to scare it off. But within a second, something punches back on the wall with such force that it shakes the entire thing. We both then hear footsteps stomping or running away from us and up the attic stairs. At this moment, we're both at a loss for words, and we immediately pack up with our son and we just leave. We even called the police and just assumed that it has to be someone who broke in, until the next day when we started to think about it. You see, the area where the scratching was occurring was above those steps, a good 10 feet, and even an extremely tall man would have trouble reaching with a ladder. However, even if they could reach, what we couldn't explain is how this thing ran on a floor that literally didn't exist. The sound of running was not up steps, but as if there was a hallway or a floor or something directly behind the wall, which obviously there wasn't. The police, they found no signs of a break-in or of any intruder being there. The security cameras, the ring outside, never had any alerts or saw anyone coming in either. And so, in the end, we just ended up selling the house as is with everything in it, and never stayed over there again. I did come down briefly a few weeks later to finish up some final business and just went to tell my father goodbye at the house. And upon entering, the house just, I don't know, it felt so hateful is the only way that I can describe it. I don't understand how a house could have feelings, but if someone was to ask me what I felt, hateful is the word that I would use. I have no idea to this date what any of it was anyway, but to clarify, had I not been in such a state of grief, I would never have investigated nor stayed after the first event. My dad always brushed off the other family members' claims to it being haunted as no big deal, and even in my childhood years visiting, I never once had an odd experience. My dad and I had a good relationship throughout his life, and he never talked about the house in a negative light. The house was built in 1879 by a French family, and after them, my family owned it from 1952 and on. Nothing traumatic ever happened there, nor any weird family events. It was just a plain old boring house prior to that week. But I'm wondering, how has everyone else coped with a truly unexplainable event like this? My wife and I still to this day cannot even talk about it without getting chills or just literally feeling insane. I'm currently living in my SUV right now, and last night around 12 a.m. I parked in a Walmart parking lot to take some sleep. It was one of the worst days that I've had in a long time, and I was absolutely exhausted, so when I got into the back of my SUV, I fell asleep right away, unfortunately forgetting to lock my doors. I've always been a very light sleeper. To be honest, I'm thankful too that I am, because somehow I woke up, turned around in my makeshift bed to face whoever was now sitting in my driver's seat of my car, looking directly at me. This is where the story somehow gets kind of funny, I guess, because I was so tired and in such a daze, all I did was continue to shake my head back and forth and say no, while reaching across this person's lap and opening the door for them and gesturing for them to leave. And thankfully, they got out. I hope whoever they were that they're okay, but quite honestly, the fact that somebody got in my car late at night like that, I don't know. I feel pretty lucky for some reason. So I, a 27-year-old female, was at the laundromat today with my father, and 1.5-year-old too. To kill some time between loads, I took my extremely active tot outside where he couldn't destroy things. There was a gas station about maybe 30 yards next door, and there was a 6-foot chain link fence halfway between that separates the lots. The area directly next to the laundromat that connected to the fence, though, was a little bit grassy and sort of a sandy open area too, with one large tree right in the center. My son runs outside and turns and starts running around in this area laughing and playing, which is great. After about a minute, though, he starts sort of running up diagonally towards the fence in the direction of the gas station. I'm sort of laughing behind him, watching his little legs go, when all of a sudden I hear footsteps approach behind me. So I turn and look, and I kid you not, it was like the movie Get Out. This man just straight knee to chest running straight towards my child with manic eyes. I bolted, scooped him up, and darted back into the laundromat so quickly. I glanced back over my shoulder when I was taking off, and the guy was now on his knees laughing and rolling around, being really weird. I'm not sure if he was just mentally ill or maybe he was high or something, but I was shaking so bad because I had no clue what his intentions really were. This was about 7 years ago when I was a teenager working at a grocery store. It was towards the end of the night and I was on my break. It was dark out, which made this even creepier, to be honest. Like I said, I was on my break sitting on a bench outside behind the grocery store. This area that I was in is basically like a back alley next to a train station railroad. It's always been sketchy, especially at nighttime. But I see this Asian lady walking with an African-American young girl. The girl is sobbing, and as they get closer, I swear that I hear the girl crying, "Help, help." This obviously sends shivers down my spine, and my blood instantly ran cold. I called the cops, and they actually did a good job. They called the train stations to see if they saw this lady getting off and warned them to look out for her. They also combed the entire store looking for this lady. Sadly, though, she was never found. My boss was mad that I called the cops without coming to her first, but I still think about this, and it always just gives me the creeps. I mean, why were they walking in a sketchy area late at night like that? Why was the girl crying for help? I don't know. Something about the whole situation felt really weird and very sketchy. What do you guys think? So this was really weird. I went rock hounding solo today to a place that my husband and I have gone before. Everything seemed normal when I arrived too. It's a very secluded area of the creek with a rock bar in the middle of the creek, and with a small patch of woods to the left and a dense forest on the right. I crossed the creek and set up on my gear, and on the rock bar, I grabbed a bag and started walking up the creek. About 45 minutes in, I kept looking up at the forest. I don't know why, but I just kept getting a really eerie feeling. Every now and again, I would hear a couple of thumps out there, but, you know, it's just nature, so I didn't think too much of it. About an hour in, I heard my first meow, though. I was so focused on pulling clay that I literally stood up and was like, I did not just hear a cat meow, did I? 10 minutes go by and I'm walking further up the creek, and damn if I didn't hear it again. I stopped and was like, yeah, I definitely just heard a cat meow. That's really weird. But something seemed really off and I started to feel uneasy, so I turned around and I started heading back to my site. Something about the meow just wasn't right. It wasn't a painful one, but just like a matter-of-fact sort of meow, if that makes sense. About 5 minutes into the trek back, I definitely hear a meow this time, and I'm sweating like crazy because of the heat, but instantly feel cold and clammy, and the hair is standing up on the back of my neck. I know what I was supposed to be hearing, a single meow, but it wasn't coming from a cat. It sounded a lot like someone or something imitating a meow. I keep focused on getting back to my site, and about 5 minutes later, another one. Here's where I realize that things are getting really weird. The meow always sounded the same distance from me, no matter how far I kept walking. I finally reach my site and pull out my drinks and plop down to rehydrate. That's when another meow sounded, and this time I knew with everything in me that it was definitely not a cat following me. I calmly gathered up my gear and started to trek across the creek to the path to my car. And then another really long drawn-out meow. I made my way across the creek and hunched down into a pit. I parked my car right next to the edge of the forest and was really starting to lose my head. I got my keys and mace out and put my gear on me so that I can dive into my car and rearrange later if I need to. And I nearly lost it, finding the courage to make it to my car, but I did, and I hightailed it out of there as quickly as I could. Now, the rational answer to this is that someone was just messing with me, but how did they get back there in the first place? It's like 200 acres of forest. I mean, really? I'm in North Alabama, and there really just shouldn't be anyone out there. I don't know. What are your thoughts? It was the early 90s, and I was 17 or 18. I had moved out of my parents' house not long before to not the safest of cities. I was a handful at the time, and I was clashing heads a lot with my parents. I had a great job, for my age anyway, $16 an hour, and the rent was low at $350, so I moved out. Anyways, my best friend and I would go for blunt rides around the city when we were bored. Back in the early 90s, the streets were pretty scenic with crackheads and corner boys. I stupidly had very little fear, and we were used to it by this stage. I was driving, and we were both pretty smoked out. She was also drinking some kind of liquor straight from the bottle as well. We had just gone through a yellow light on one of the main roads when I noticed the car behind us had a police light on the roof and was flashing their headlights at me. Oh man. My friend starts freaking out, shoving the bottle under her seat, already almost in tears. I didn't think twice about it. Back then, there were undercovers everywhere. I pulled onto the side of the pretty busy street, hiding the blunt, and watched the driver take the light off of his roof and start walking towards us. He tells me that he has seen us driving up and down the streets looking for drugs and demands our IDs. He's leaning in and close to my face, looking back and forth at both of us and sniffing the air. He was a really big guy too, kind of unkempt to be honest. But we fish out our IDs and hand them to him. He tells us that we're in big trouble apparently. In my sort of rebellious dumb head, I'm thinking, what? What for? Well, we weren't looking for drugs, just sort of joyriding and smoking some weed. He goes back to his car. By then, my friend is in a puddle of tears. She was no angel either. She was pretty drunk and high and freaking out. But he finally comes back and tells us that he talked to his partner. There was another man in his car, and his partner decided to take it easy on us. He said that he would let us go with a warning if we gave him all of our weed and went home. I remember quickly calculating the situation. Plain clothes, undercover car, just wants our weed. It just didn't add up. Just at that moment, an actual police car too was driving by on the other side of the street. The guy saw it too and stepped back a little. I just reacted and opened the door and went to the middle of the street waving my arms at the cop car. I remember the look on the guy's face, like a confused caught kid with nowhere to go. The cops were coming to a light and not going fast anyway. They stopped right there and I just started asking them before they could say anything, is this guy a real cop? They looked confused. The guy looked like he didn't know what to do. I was yelling to the real cops that this guy said that he was a cop and pulled us over. The guy started fast walking back to his car and partner. The cops left their car in the middle of the street and went after him, and they got him. More cops showed up, and my high is completely gone at this point. The fake cop's car is absolutely swarmed all of a sudden, and I finally see them both being taken to a cop car in cuffs. The cop that originally stopped came back to my car with our IDs and explained to us that this wasn't the first time that these guys had pulled their fake cop act. Asked me if I was okay to drive home, took our information and said that they would be in touch. I was shaken, but I guess more mad than anything. We went back to my apartment and, well, that was pretty much that. Now, for some time I had a bit of a habit of checking out the police logs and court sentencing in the local paper, and I found the guy's court appearance, which also contained a mugshot and a short article about how many times he had done the same to other women. And the danger that we could have been in didn't really sink into my stupid teenage brain until I read that apparently he had stabbed 2 of those young women. I still remember his face and his name even. The court record said that he got a 20-year sentence for it as well. I wasn't a big fan of police back then, but I thank God that they just happened to be driving by that day, because if they hadn't, I really don't know what would have went down. So, it's nighttime, and just to preface, whatever happened, all of the windows in the house are closed except mine. Now, my brother said that he let both of my cats out a few minutes ago, and there's no way or reason for him to lie about that. He's a bit of a night owl and always up all night, so it's sort of kind of his duty to let them out every night, or else they sort of keep everyone up. I was just sat in my bed listening to music and reading on my laptop, door fully closed and the hall light on outside, so I'd know if it was opened. My cat loves to cuddle up any time of the day and sometimes likes to sit underneath my bed even. I always left his favorite blanket under there for him because of this too. And what I thought was my cat came up to my bed, seemingly to jump up on it. So without looking properly, I started patting the bed and sort of making a noise, which is just something that I do for him to get up on. He's shaking side to side like he's going to jump up, but he doesn't. And at this point, I think that he looks really weird from the corner of my eye. I glance at him for a second, and he does look super weird. Because I can't really see his face, but at telling from the dark and the light from my laptop, he looks really scary. Now, I don't know how to describe what I was looking at, but it was this sort of hairless and really sickly pale grey-coloured cat, and not wrinkly, but shaped sort of like a bobcat? I don't know. It looked like bread dough, but with legs, for real. I thought that I was tripping out because it was so dark, so I looked back at him and bent down to try and stroke him, but he immediately jumped under my bed. Yes, jumped. Ran so fast that it wasn't running, it was more like one motion, I guess. This wasn't like the corner of my eye type of situation too. I glanced at him, thought, he looks really weird, then looked back at him straight on and saw the same thing. It's not even like it could have been lighting either, because he's a fluffy brown and black cat. So why would he look like that? It couldn't have been something on the floor either, because I always keep my floor spotless. But after 10 minutes of sitting there terrified, I manned up, got off my bed, turned on the lamp and looked under, but when I did, It was entirely empty, other than the blanket. Then I looked around all of the places a cat could hide in my room, but there was nothing. Everything that he could get in was closed, and the door is too, so he couldn't have run out. It just really freaked me out. I don't know if I'm just going crazy, but at first I thought that it felt like him, like his presence just felt like it was his, so I didn't think anything was wrong. Then I felt kind of ill when I got a glimpse. Am I just having a gas leak, seeing a ghost cat, or should I go and see the doctor for a diagnosis on schizophrenia? He has a dead twin brother, if that means anything, but he wasn't bald, nor did he like to cuddle. Only at night when he slept with me, but not in the room that I'm in now, so I don't know. I really don't know what to think about all of this. All I know is that I definitely saw something, and it was not my cat. So I was 10 years old at the time, and it was summer break after finishing 5th grade. It was maybe the 2nd or 3rd week of June. I don't really remember why, but my mum had to go to a dinner with some of her co-workers from the daycare that she worked at one night. She left my older sister, who was only 12, to watch over me, but my older sister was more so there to make sure that the house doesn't burn down rather than watching over me, I guess. That night, my mum left for the dinner, and she said that she would be right back. I remember that I was in the living room and my older sister was upstairs in her room. I was also downstairs with Fenrir, who was a black Newfoundland that I grew up with my entire life. Unfortunately, by the time that I was 10, he was showing his age. He couldn't really walk, run, or stand up like he used to. We would usually have to help him up and walk him outside to the backyard, which had a porch. The porch had a walkway that we had built so that Fenrir could walk down easier. We would also have to bring his food and water bowls over to him, as he was always too tired to get up. So I'm watching TV in the living room with Fenrir lying down by the side of the couch, when suddenly I hear this loud growling. I muted the TV, turned around, and saw Fenrir growling and snarling at something. He then started barking at something, and I looked over and saw that he was directing his attention at the back door that led to the backyard, but I didn't see anything as it was pitch black outside. Suddenly, he just stood up with seemingly little to no effort, which was weird for him, and was violently growling, snarling, and barking. But keep in mind, he hasn't been able to get up by himself in a while, so to just see him stand up like he was young again scared me a lot. I used to say that it was like as if Fenrir got possessed or something. Anyway, he was still directing his attention to the back door, but before I could react, he suddenly jogged over to the back door and got on his hind legs and started scratching on the glass that was on the door, still growling and barking. At first, I thought that a squirrel probably got up to the porch and came up to the back door or something. But then I remembered that he wasn't even this aggressive towards squirrels. What I mean is that when he would see one, when he was younger that is, he would bark and chase it, yes, but it was more so to sort of scare the squirrel off rather than actually hurt it. And to add to that, he was not an aggressive dog. He would always be really sweet to people and other pets. He was also usually calm, so to see him going feral like this actually really scared me. He sounded like he wanted to kill something, if that gives you an idea of how aggressive he was. In any case, I finally walked over to the back door where he was clawing at. I sort of pushed him away, surprised that he didn't snap at me, and I decided to put my face against the glass to peek out and see if anything was there, but I didn't see anything. All the while, Fenrir is still scratching, growling, barking, and now baring his teeth and drooling to my right. I then walked to the right, where there was a light switch that turned on the porch lights, and Fenrir went back into his spot, scratching and growling at whatever he was upset about. I flipped the light switch on, and the second that happened, I saw a man dressed in all black, classic burglar outfit, with gloves, a ski mask, and everything. At first, he was seemingly looking into the back door with his face and hands pressed up against it, and when I turned on the lights, he got startled and took a few steps back. He then turned over to me, and it was like time just froze. We were both frozen, just staring at each other for a few seconds. Me being only 10 and not really knowing what to do, I quickly reached out to the knob of one of the back doors, more specifically the door that Fenrir was still scratching at, and swung the door open. The guy tried to run, but Fenrir was right on top of him. The guy wasn't even able to get off the porch before he was latched onto. When I say latched onto as well, I mean really latched on. Fenrir had first bitten down on the guy's leg, and then moved and was biting down on the guy's arm now. The guy tried to hit him off, but he was just not able to. I was just frozen, staring down at Fenrir, really biting down on this guy. To be honest, I was more scared of my own dog than the guy that was most likely trying to break in, since I'd never seen him be this aggressive in my entire life. I actually thought that Fenrir was just going to straight up kill this guy. But eventually the guy screams in agony, which I guess caused my sister to run downstairs to see what was going on. Not really sure why she didn't come downstairs when Fenrir was growling and barking the first time, but I digress. My older sister was freaking out and eventually called 911. She then told me to go to my bedroom, which was also upstairs, and so I did. I ran up to my bedroom and just stayed there, in shock of what I had just seen and the whole situation in general. A while later, the police showed up and my mum eventually showed up too. She burst through my bedroom and basically gave me the tightest bear hug that I'd ever gotten from her. I remember that she was also crying, worried sick that I was hurt. While I was shaken up, I wasn't physically hurt though. But at one point, I finally go downstairs and I see my older sister talking to the police officer, while Fenrir was lying down next to her with some blood on his face, much like Cujo. I remember thinking at the time, oh my goodness, Fenrir just killed somebody. And then I also remembered that when I put my face up against the glass on one of the back doors to see what Fenrir was so angry about, I most likely put my face directly where the guy still had his face up against it on the other side. So that means that I must have made direct eye contact with this guy before I turned the lights on without even knowing it. However, while the guy did lose a lot of blood, thankfully, or maybe not, I don't know, he didn't die. And to be honest, I don't really know what happened to the guy afterwards, other than that he had to have gotten arrested, obviously. My mum was instantly looking into buying a new house after this and moving, and we all eventually did move when I was maybe 11 or 12. Unfortunately, before that, first, I had developed my intense fear of dealing with intruders, so much so that I couldn't look outside windows when it was pitch black outside for a while because I was afraid that I was just going to see a face right there. And second, a few months before we moved, we had to put Fenrir down because he was just too old now. Needless to say though, that 2014 was the year that my childhood and innocence all died. I'm 18 years old now, and I've since been able to look outside windows when it's dark outside now. While I am still afraid of intruders, it's not really as bad as it used to be. When I move out, I'm definitely getting a big dog of my own though. I will forever be thankful for you, Fenrir. Had it not been for you, who knows what that guy could have done to either me or my older sister. So my whole family is, I guess you could say, in tune with some kind of spirituality or paranormal stuff. I really don't know what to call it, but whatever you want to name it. Both my parents and all my siblings, there are 8 of us, have seen or heard or felt ghosts, demons, or other dimensional beings, or whatever you want to call them. I have a handful of stories, both from my personal experiences and stories that my family has told me. This is my first time sharing this. After I heard a couple of stories from others, I was inspired to share my own. I'll probably eventually share more, but For now, let me tell you about these green hands that I saw when I was 8 years old. So I was scared of the dark until I was about 27. I'm 32 now. I was always a bit of a scared little boy because of all the stuff that I'd seen and heard, so I used to sleep with the light on when I was a kid. I shared a room with my older brother, but my bedtime was like 8 p.m. and this was 11 or 12. For hours I would be too afraid to fall asleep, and I would wait for him to come to bed so that I'd feel sort of safe closing my eyes, knowing that he's with me, you know. Sometimes he just wouldn't come to sleep, so I eventually fell asleep waiting for him with the light on. Whenever I closed my eyes, I would be so scared of seeing something in front of me, like a huge face or a monster or something like that, when I opened them. So I would pull the blankets over my head and tuck my feet in and sleep all walled up under the tight blankets and try to sleep. But because I was a bit of a fat kid, I would sweat on the pillow because it was so hot under there, breathing so hard. My brother would come home late at night sometimes, and he would be super angry that the pillow would be so damp and the blankets and all that. So he made us use a bed sheet as a blanket since it was way thinner. For nights and nights I slept under the sheet and didn't sweat anymore. But one night I wasn't tired and I just couldn't go to sleep. I remember staring around the room and was just sort of talking to myself and imagining what I would do tomorrow at school and stuff like that. Just kid stuff. I remember this clear as day as well. I know it to be true, but I don't know. Who really knows about these things, right? Anyway, as I'm laying there, on my back, I had the sheet tucked under my heels so the sheet was pulled tight and taut over my toes. It was a Mickey Mouse, a Goofy, and a Donald Duck sheet. I don't remember if I heard a noise or anything, but I was staring at my feet and all of a sudden I saw these two huge green hands slowly creeping up from under the bed. It was the foot of the bed too, because there were no sides. And now, these hands were ugly, like straight up green like a goblin or an orc, long nails, yellowish, bumpy, and each hand was like the size of two hands. They both together came up, hands open like they were going to high-five my feet or something, and I remember it was so slow too. I was completely paralyzed. I couldn't move, scream, or do anything but stare. It was so unreal. They crept, they grabbed the loose sheet under my feet, and pulled it hard from under my heels, and then slowly lifted the sheet over my feet. Now I can see my skin, I saw my feet exposed, and they let go of the sheet right before they grabbed me, and I just absolutely screamed. Like instant crying and tears and screaming. I jerked my feet back and saw them slowly slither sort of back under the bed with their hands still open. A good description of them, actually, is that they look sort of like they belong to that eyeball hand creature from Pan's Labyrinth, only green. In any case, I screamed for my mum and my stepdad while crying and with my knees curled up to my chest, and I remember my parents took their sweet time to come to my aid too. I felt like I was sitting on my bed screaming for 30, 40, maybe 50 whole seconds. That's a long time as well for a little kid. So when my mum busted in to see what was wrong, I immediately jumped off the bed and ran into her arms crying, pointing at the end of the bed telling her, "There's hands, there's green hands, I saw them." And she was like, "What? What are you talking about?" My stepdad came in and she told him what I had said, and he was just as confused. He walked over, checked under the bed, and found nothing, of course. Just a backpack and a shirt and maybe a wrestling toy. Steve Austin, I think. But apart from that, nothing was there, and he said that I must have just been dreaming. Now, I know for sure that I was not dreaming because this night I just couldn't sleep, and I decided to just stay awake and wait for my brother to come home like I always did. I never pulled the sheet over my head too. That's how I slept every night. The sheet over my head. And I can't see them, and they can't see me kind of thing, so I know that I wasn't dreaming. Definitely not. So now I'm trembling, horrified, snotty-nosed, watery-eyed, rambling kid, and I begged my mum to let me sleep with my sisters. She said no. She said Dad said no, and it was just a dream. Go back to sleep, you'll be okay. But no, I am not sleeping on that bed or this room tonight. And so I begged and cried and squeezed her harder, looking up at her, pleading for my life, it felt. And eventually she said okay, just tonight. I slept with my sisters for like 2 weeks though, because to heck with that. But my mum is religious and we all went to church on Sundays, and she just wanted us to pray and that I would be safe, but even still, I just couldn't sleep in that room anymore unless I was with someone. No one knew what happened too. It was just a really weird night, I guess. But my sisters knew something must have happened because we all saw some weird stuff in that house and other houses too, so that was just another thing to add to why we like to sleep with the lights on. After many months, I think I just forgot about what happened, I guess. I moved into my sister's room and we shared it. I really don't know what to say, but that I saw green hands. I felt them pull the sheet over my feet, and I know that I saw it. I don't know what they were or what they were connected to or who or nothing perhaps. It's scary for sure, but now as an adult, I really don't know what to think. It's really odd, isn't it? It's terrifying, but I don't know. Maybe I hallucinated it or something. Maybe I did dream it. Who knows? As an adult, I really don't know how to explain it, if I'm being honest. I'm open to possibilities, but deep inside of me, I still believe that it was real and that it did actually happen. This story is from 2019. I was 13 years old at the time, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. Maybe it's due to trauma. I don't know. I was bored at home alone. I FaceTimed my best friend, who lives in the apartment building next to mine, and asked him if he would join me in a walk around the neighborhood. He wasn't there. He was on his way back home from school, which is understandable because it was a Thursday afternoon. There is a jogging circuit near my house. It's like 500 meters away. But due to my massive boredom, I put on my sports clothes, a basic t-shirt plus some shorts. The shorts have no pockets, and this is an important detail. I then was headed with my music vibing to the circuit. Arriving there, it was surprisingly not that empty, around maybe 8 to 10 people in that 15-kilometer circuit. I started walking for a bit, then ran for a couple of kilometers and laid down in the grass. Now, I noticed 2 guys on a motorcycle going back and forth. I didn't care that much since I was sort of FaceTiming my 2 best friends anyway. It was getting pretty late. It was around 6 p.m. I guess, and I was exhausted. I walked home, but I took another path that is kind of like a shortcut, I guess. I had to walk through an empty big street with buildings and construction. I took that same path many times before with no problems. But I had a feeling that someone was watching me and following me. So I turned around and noticed the same 2 guys on their motorcycle heading toward me. I sort of whispered to my friends on FaceTime that something weird is going to happen and that they have to cut their mics and focus with me. The guys came by and one of them asked me where the nearest barber shop was. Out of stress, I gave them a random location. While the rider of the bike asked about the barber shop, my right eye twitched and unfocused a bit. It always does this when I'm heavily stressed, but I was still able to see with it. And I saw in the bike's rearview mirror that the other guy was trying to look at where my phone is. It was between my short and my belly because I had no pockets and I had my earphones on. I immediately freaked out though. Time was starting to slow down. Seconds felt like hours and I could no longer feel my legs. They went on, but with a slow speed. It was sort of like they were planning a backup plan or something. In any case, I had 3 options. There was a taxi guy fixing his car. I could have went to him and explained the situation, but my gut said, what if they noticed me and came back, and maybe they do what they plan to do anyway. 2, I could stop at a random car and hop in with them and explain the situation. My gut said no, because what if the car was locked? Plus, the guys would have noticed that I knew what they were planning to do, and they would have come to me after the random car would go. Or 3, and this is what I chose, run in the opposite direction into the traffic and take the path that I came by. I instinctively ran for a straight 5 minutes, eventually couldn't do it anymore, and I entered a field and started running again towards some slums. I looked back and I saw the guys coming up after me into the field, and one of them was shouting, just stop, we just want to know where the barber shop is. There's this one thing about me though, and it's that I always trust my gut, and it said, no, run as fast as you can, or you're about to die today. And that's what I did. I ran between the slums and kept running until I arrived near my best friend's house, who I was still in FaceTime with. I told him to come down the stairs right now, and I laid down in the parking lot. He came and was freaked out because he knew that something was happening, but didn't know what since I hadn't given him all the information yet. My face turned yellowish and I threw up. I couldn't feel my legs nor my arms anymore. He walked me into the house and I laid down, and from that moment, to be honest, I don't remember much more. I just remember sort of waking up the following day with bruises on my legs due to me running into the field full of spikes and stuff. And that was it. The whole story happened in the space of maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And now, these days, I take that same path again with no worries, but man, I stayed off that path for quite some time after this. So I was adopted into my current family about 5 years ago, that being February of 2017. My family had a nice house where my siblings and we all had our own room. There was also a basement, which at the time was a game room for all of us and was the biggest room in the house. Eventually, my 2 older brothers moved out during the second year of me living there. When they did, my sister and I decided to switch rooms. I got her room and she got the basement room. During those 2-ish years, my sister complained about numerous nightmares, I guess you could call them, and claimed to have seen dark shadows at night, as well as hearing the boiler room and storage room door open. Me and my parents would just sort of laugh at the claims and would say that it was because of how late she would stay up and all those energy drinks that she had. To be honest though, I really wish that I hadn't laughed. This past December of 2021, my sister moved out due to her graduating early, and my parents renovated the basement room where I then moved into. I was genuinely excited to have my own space downstairs too. It was about the size of a smaller studio apartment, I guess, with enough closet space and a bathroom with a walk-in shower, and on my first night in the basement, it was so messy due to moving everything downstairs that I stayed up past midnight organizing everything, just wanting to get it done, basically. And sure enough, I heard the basement door open. I thought that it was my mum at first, so I naturally joked around and said, "Isn't it past your bedtime?" I called this out. I opened the bedroom door, looked up the stairs to see the door was just wide open. I was kind of confused, but shook it off and just closed it. I went back downstairs and closed the bedroom door. I eventually finished and went to bed. In the morning, I asked my mum if she went down there during the night, and she denied it. She claimed it was just me being tired, so I shook it off. I didn't experience anything for a few days too. But then, I came home from school one evening. I was home alone and came home to all of the basement doors open, as well as the door to the basement. We do have cats that weren't allowed downstairs, so I worried that they may have gotten into things. My mum never forgets to close the door too because of that, so I immediately thought that someone may have broken in. But our front and back doors were all locked still, and I come in through the garage. I ran to check and I saw our cat in the boiler room. She was in the far corner and I could hear her hissing at something. I swear on my biological parents too that boiler room door swung closed. It's hard to shut too due to the wood door frame being somewhat uneven, and that was what really confused me. Me, trying to be brave now, I went into the corner, grabbed my cat, and I opened the door. I shut the remaining doors and went back upstairs, where I found my mum just coming home. "What are you doing with the cat?" she asked me. "Did you leave a bunch of doors open?" I asked her. "No, I haven't been home since like 8 o'clock, and I haven't needed to go down there. Why?" I told her about what happened, and she mentioned how maybe my brothers stopped by and pulled a prank on me or something. But neither of us could explain the door swinging closed. That night, I couldn't fall asleep too. I began to get all paranoid and started to overthink the situation from earlier. And then it hit me. I remembered the things that my sister complained about when she lived in the basement. The next morning, I brought it up to my mum, and she looked somewhat concerned, I guess. She never believed in the paranormal stuff, but I did. I'm pretty sure that this convinced her, though. And after this, it just kept happening. The boiler room door would open mostly, but from time to time, my bedroom door and the storage room door would open too. Lights going crazy on and off happened a few times as well. I had my one and only incident of sleep paralysis too, where I thought that I saw a tall shadow in the bathroom doorway. And it was around this time that I decided to ask for help. My friend's mum was a medium, and I asked her if she could come to look and step into the basement to see. She agreed and came over one night. It was back in April. She said that she was drawn into the boiler room immediately too. She claimed that the energy was dark in the boiler room, specifically, and that there was some type of spirit and perhaps an entity that was trying to find peace and was just angry. She suggested that we get the house blessed by a professional, so my mum and I appreciated the help and she left. My parents, they knew the house's history too, and we were all confused. To this day, now late May of 2022, these events still occur despite having the house blessed 2 times, but the activity has slowed down somewhat. I honestly believe that my sister's collectible antiques may have gotten attached to the house, but I'm not sure. She had a few creepy, sort of like clown dolls and old frames for aesthetic purposes back in high school, but then again, those items aren't in our house anymore. I don't know. I'll take any tips if you have them, but thanks for listening. This happened to me during the summer of 2017. I'm a girl and I was 19 during the events. So, I'm going to try and stay a bit vague regarding the details, like the country of happening, the origins of the people, the name of the places, because I don't want to be recognized or cause bad reputation to any community. Now, I was living in an apartment with my family. On the parking lot, there were always several guys repairing cars. I used to come back late home pretty often and see these guys just talking and sometimes saying to me good evening, and one time I got as a joke, "We kept you a spot," nothing inappropriate. I would always just answer politely and take it as a gesture of goodwill. I had noticed that one of them had tuned up a sedan and must be living in the same building as me, but a different entrance, because in the morning the car was parked there. It was really recognizable. One morning I was going to my work and I realized that this car is parked next to mine. And well, he doesn't live far, so it's not that weird, I guess. But when I got into my car and I sat in there, I realized the owner is actually seated in his car and looking at me and sort of smiling at me. Well, okay, it's 8:30 a.m. I mean, why not? I start to drive to get to my work, and I'm in the special roundabout where you have to sort of stop inside if a car on the right is coming, which is the case, so I'm stopped there. I'm looking at the right to see when I can go and realize that in the second lane, the car is there. As soon as I take the road for work, he's behind me. Even when we get real close, he's still there. I was working in a mall with the biggest hypermarket of the neighborhood, so I thought maybe he was just going for groceries or something. I get into the underground parking lot and I park, and he does the same right next to me. I chose to ignore him and go for the escalator. And well, you can probably guess what happened. Yep, he does the same and starts to talk to me. Hey, I'm Steve, and you? Oh, I'm Anna. How old are you? I'm 19. I'm 27. Is that a problem? No. Why would it be? Oh, okay, so you work here? We arrived at the place where I worked. Yeah? Okay, well, I'll see you tonight then. Bye. So at this moment, I realized that he's not really speaking the language well. I answered the questions because he didn't seem scary and, well, I didn't want to make a scene. When he said bye, I thought, yeah, I guess I will see him every night in my parking lot with his friends, so that's normal, right? But back when I finished work, the exact same thing that in the morning happened. While I sat in my car, I realized the guy was right next to me. Since I was surprised and he seemed really eager to talk to me, I got out and was like, "What are you doing here?" "Oh, I have something for you," showing me a big smile. "What? No." And he gave me a red rose. Embarrassed and a bit shocked. It was the first flower that someone had ever given me, by the way. I refused it a couple of times, but he kept on insisting. I knew the only way that I could get rid of him would be to accept it, which I did, and he left. I kept the flower in my car so my family didn't realize something is happening, and I threw it in a trash can outside later. So, this was the beginning of the week, and he started to wait for me after work to give me drinks, to ask me out for a cinema date. I actually said to this, "But you don't speak the language well enough." "You'll teach me," he said. Or sometimes he invited me to a restaurant. Obviously, I refused everything, but ended up accepting the drinks to make him leave. On the weekend, I had a second job as well. I had these late shifts in fast food. It was my first shift there since everything happened, and I was closing the restaurant with 3 other colleagues. Since it's pretty dark and late, there was a rule that one of us had to leave first and drive around the restaurant to make sure it was safe for everyone. I wouldn't do that normally, but this night I had a really weird feeling that he might be here. So I volunteered for the drive and, well, right on the spot, he was parked next to my car. It was 1 a.m. And I mean, how long was he waiting there for? I told him to go a bit further, otherwise we can't leave, which he did. After my colleagues left, I stopped next to his car and opened the window, just to explain to him why I reacted like that. Not that I had to explain myself, but I thought that maybe he'd follow me until I explain. And before I knew it, he opened his car door and then got into my car. I just want to remind you that this man knew where I worked, where I lived, what my car looked like, and even who my family was. And it was a neighbor. That's why I never wanted to make a scene, I guess, but at this very moment, I was pretty scared for my life, I guess. A 27-year-old muscular guy that I didn't know was in my car at 1 a.m. in an empty parking lot. He seemed, I don't know, talkative, and I didn't have any other choice, so I decided to listen to him and learn stuff about him too. He said that he arrived in the country in 2014 at the capital, stayed there 2 years, and in 2017 he got in our neighborhood. I did the maths and realized that there was a whole year missing. I asked, and he answered, "Oh, I was in jail." You can probably imagine just how scared I was upon hearing that. "Why were you in jail?" "Well, I didn't have papers and I had a car accident." Okay, it wasn't that scary in the end, which reassured me. The guy said goodnight and he left. There were many times when I checked the inside mirror and would see that he was right behind me. I obviously wouldn't know every time that he was there, but even to this day, I check really often to see if a car is following me. Once, I was washing the dishes during a late shift. I had my phone and was texting friends, 2 guys, to let them know when I was finished and that we could meet. And well, I was working, so I had to leave my phone. And maybe half an hour later, a colleague comes to me and says, "Hey, your friend ordered at the drive-thru and asked for you, and he said that he wanted to meet you later." I took my phone and said, "So you came by? Were you alone? What are you talking about?" At this moment, I rushed to my colleague and asked her to describe the guy in the car, and as you can guess, it was Steve. Now, I won't bore you with all the rest of the details, but there were so many cases of things like this happening. He followed me to my friends, threatened to reveal stuff about a friend to his dad that he knew. Also, one of his friends, Carl, who I spotted on my parking lot, had followed me a couple of times too. A friend who knew Carl was told that he was married, had kids and was like 40, and I was really shocked by that. One evening though, around 10 p.m. maybe, and it was already dark, I parked and saw a friend or a neighbor getting home. It had been a while, so we talked a bit. He said that he'll be back in 2, so we can chat. And while waiting, I'm getting my stuff in the trunk. This is when the car parked behind me flashes its lights at me. I didn't have to turn around to guess who it was. I'd been patient since nothing too crazy had happened, and I didn't want to scare or create problems for my family, but this night I was pretty angry, and it was happening right next to my place. So I threw my stuff down and I rushed at the car. Both Steve and Carl were there, and I told them to leave, to stop following me. Steve didn't say a word, and Carl just sort of smiled and said goodnight. I didn't answer and left. And well, it must have worked because they didn't bother me for months. Steve changed his car and now had a black one, which was still a really recognizable car. He followed me a few more times, and one day he even tried to talk with me with a friend that could translate well what he was saying. I explained to his friend that I just wasn't interested and that it was the last time that I talked to him. However, months later, I see in my neighborhood this kid that I knew from sports, and I knew that he lived in an apartment at about the same place as Steve. The whole thing was over, but it was always in the back of my head. I didn't really know who the guy was and didn't know if this would start again. I was curious though, and you know how curiosity is a bad thing, I guess. I started to talk to him. I was like, "Hey, do you know this guy," giving a physical trait, "that lives in your building?" "Oh yeah, this guy." And he gives a description. No, the guy who owns the black car." "Oh, you mean my dad?" I froze. I have no idea how this conversation ended, since it's still a huge shock even to this day. I know that I didn't tell him anything about his dad's behavior, though. I knew this kid for so many years, and he was actually the son of this guy. And apparently he had 3 or 4 brothers and sisters, too. Then I realized that the guy had totally lied about his age because this kid was like 15, and I believed him like an idiot. But this is not the end of the stunning discoveries that I made. You see, a few days after, I meet a friend who knows about these events and tell her that the kid, that she knows too, is his son. She looked at me sort of shocked and she said, "All this time it was this guy? What, you know him? He left his country because he stole money from powerful people and joined his family here but got into jail for suspicion of terrorism or something." And I mean, what the heck, right? And I remember that when he followed me, he would actually stop when I would arrive in the direction of the police station. I just thought it was because he still had issues with his papers or something. She kept talking and showed me a video. This is his wife here, and the second woman is his second wife. She was apparently so tired of him talking to other girls that she went to their country to find a second wife for him. I want to be precise here and tell you that my friend had come from the same country as this guy, but she was born here. That's why she had this kind of information, I guess. Small community. It was a small community, so they kind of know. It was a small community, so they kind of all know each other. So, in the end, I think that I was very lucky that nothing actually happened to me. I still find it hard to believe that it actually happened the way that it did. I wonder sometimes how it would have gone if I had acted differently. But that's a thought that I try to keep out of my head, because dwelling on these things is pretty terrifying. So I moved to Canyon Lake, Texas in my junior year of high school. My family's house was built from the ground up on the south side of the lake. My parents didn't know that this was the side of the lake that most people avoided. I don't mean to be offensive, but most of the people that I knew lived on the north side, and I never understood why until, well, the events started happening. You see, the house was finished in the summer going into my junior year, and when we officially moved in, things were great. A few months into me beginning school is when things turned incredibly dark, though. It all began when my dad put his guitar in our family room by the fireplace. I would come home and something would string the guitar strings so violently that it sounded as if somebody knocked it over. I began waking up to my dad being completely weirded out because all of our cabinets and doors on the first floor would be open. It escalated drastically from here, too. We would hear something in the woods just outside of the porch lights continually. First, we thought it was an injured animal, but dead deer and other wildlife would appear on our property every few weeks. Then, we began to see unhuman things. Guests would see something walking in the hallways, opening drawers, and would see a girl in our guest house. My dad was constantly hosting events and parties, including his ex-military friends. They would ask us why we were coming to their rooms at night and opening the drawers and closets and then walking out. My dad didn't believe me until his friends began commenting on figures or people in the house. But the worst night was when all the doors began opening and slamming, and it sounded as if someone was walking up and down the stairs and going into every room, opening and closing the doors over and over again. I could honestly go on and on about the things that I saw in that house too. It was genuinely one of the scariest times in my life. I'm happy to answer any and all questions, but all in all, do not go to Canyon Lake, Texas. I grew up with my grandma and lived with her most of my life, and her house always freaked me out because weird things happened. It's not like the house was old. No one had ever lived there previously, and it wasn't the typical scary house that you think of when you think of a haunted house. I guess I have my theories, but that's for another time, I suppose. Anyways, everyone in my family who stayed there has their own stories of things that they've seen or heard, including myself. Some examples of what I experienced were hearing footsteps outside my door in the middle of the night, hearing someone in the master bathroom walking around and turning the sink on when I was the only one home. When I was young, I was sneaking downstairs to grab a snack and turned the corner to go downstairs and saw a little girl sitting on the big box that we had at the bottom of the stairs, seeing figures of people on the walls moving around. Honestly, the list goes on. These things happened throughout my life and were spaced out occurrences, so I tried to just ignore it all the best that I could. But what I experienced when my grandma was dying were some of the most intense things that I have ever witnessed. So my grandma had breast cancer, and eventually it spread throughout her body and she lost the battle. They put her on hospice, and we set up her living room for her to stay in so we could take care of her. The last week of her life is when things started getting just really weird. For instance, I would be sitting on the couch next to her bed and see people in the corner of my eye walking past the doorway in the hallway, even when it was just me and her in the house. And when other people were there, they saw it too. There were times where she would be looking up to the ceiling or at the walls and smile like she was looking at someone that she knew. Another time, my whole family was on the couch just being with her, and the light in the room went out, and my grandma smiled and said, "It'll come back on." And right when she said that, it did. Now, while these occurrences were starting to happen frequently, it was just little things like that. But then, the last few days of her life, she started declining more, so we bought a baby monitor with a camera to watch her when we weren't in the room to make sure that she didn't try and leave the bed or something. She kept trying to do things on her own and would fall. Well, one night my sister and I were upstairs in her bedroom talking, and we looked at the monitor screen, and I instantly started crying from what I saw. It's hard to describe what we saw, but the only thing that comes close to what it looked like was a mix of a sort of a gremlin and golem. It felt so off though. We watched it almost crawl or jump onto her bed. She was asleep, but it seemed like she knew it was there because she made a movement with her hand like she was hitting it away, and once she did that, it left. My sister went downstairs to check on her. She was still sleeping and nothing was there. It was one of the creepiest and weirdest things that I've ever seen in my life, and even after 6 years, just the thought of it makes the hair on my arm stand up, and my eyes begin to tear up too. It's not just because of how scary it looked, but because of the way it made me feel, I guess. Even through the monitor, you could almost like feel its presence, and you could feel that it was not good, whatever it was. The next night, my sister and I were back up in her bedroom watching a movie, and my sister looked at the monitor and studied it for a second and told me to take a look at it, which, after what I had already witnessed, I was terrified to even look, but I did, and clear as day, you could see a head behind my grandma, which looked like she looked at the time, sort of bold and sick and etc. So we took a picture of the monitor screen this time, and we zoomed in to see what it was. We noticed above that head was my uncle's face. You could see his features and could easily recognize it was him if you knew him. He was my grandma's son, who died a few years back from cancer as well. While I don't really believe in God and am not sure where I stand on the afterlife, even after all my experiences, it was a feeling of relief, I guess, seeing this after the horror I saw the night before. Almost like him saying, "It's okay, I've got her." I have no idea what the head was behind her. My sister thinks it could be her starting to leave her body. It did look like it was her, just watching her body laying there. A couple of days later, she passed away too. For the next month, we stayed there to pack up her house and sell it, and while there were some weird occurrences from time to time, that was pretty normal for the house, and it seemed like all the insanity and the activity that occurred while she was dying had left with her. But I'll never forget the things that I saw in that house during that time, and even as I'm sharing all of this, I have goosebumps. I do have the picture that we took of the monitor. It's a pretty unsettling photo and shows my grandma too, so I'm not sure if I'll post it unless I'm able to cover her for the sake of my own family. But anyway, thanks for listening, and yeah, it was a crazy time. I really wasn't sure where to share this, but I need the validation that I'm not insane. You see, I've never really had paranormal experiences, but I just cannot explain this. I'm in college, and me and some other 7 people from my school went on a backpacking trip, and we had 2 experienced leaders with us. We drove to Zaleski State Forest, which is in the Appalachian region of Ohio. It was early April this year, and it was cold, and everything was still dead from winter. After hiking miles into the forest, we set up camp at the backpacking campsite, and there were a couple of other groups of people as well. A few of them were friendly older couples, and then 2 college-age girls. Everyone was pretty spread out from each other, and we set up camp farther away from everyone else. Now, I've always been able to, sense energies of places, I guess you could say. And the energy in this area wasn't great. In fact, it was almost sort of spooky. Each of us had individual one-person tents, and we formed a kind of cluster in this site, with my tent being in the back, so no one was behind me. Our cluster was also right next to the forest because this backpacking site was like a big cleared-off square in the middle of the trees. So, fast forward, I'm dead asleep around 2 a.m. and I wake up to leaves crunching right behind my tent. I hear footsteps walking in circles around my tent. They had a sort of heaviness to them that couldn't be a deer or a dog. Also, it didn't sound like just two legs. Whatever this was, though, this creature was circling my tent for long periods of time, slowly creeping up to the sides of my tent, and then just stopping for some time, and then would move on to walking around the rest of the tent cluster. I could also hear a human-like breathing from the mouth when it was close to my tent, like a light sort of heaving or something. I was shaking, too scared to unzip my tent and investigate. I kid you not, too, that this occurred for hours, and it seemed like I was the only one awake. When out of nowhere, I see an illuminated light shape from my tent, although I couldn't tell what it was from inside of my tent, because it was all zipped up. But it was like a warm glow, I guess. I might have assumed that it was someone's flashlight, except nobody was moving. I was paralyzed in fear. I simply couldn't believe that this was an animal, and at some point, I must have fell asleep due to sheer exhaustion, but I could hear the footsteps circling until I did. I really don't remember much after that, but in the morning I questioned my fellow campers about it, and my leader admitted that she heard the footsteps and noises as well, admitting that it was bizarre and she would have investigated had she not been so groggy. One of the boys in the group said that he also noticed the light that came on, but thought that it was someone else. Not a single person in this group, though, went up to go to the bathroom or turned on a light that night, so I know for sure that it was nobody else from our group at least. I've heard things about the Appalachian regions being creepy and bizarre, and to be honest, now I believe it. Have any of you guys had any similar experiences? And if you have, what happened? Back when I was still working in a rehab facility as a social worker for girls who were victims of SA, it was out of town. I would take a jeepney and a bus as well to get to my workplace. I was an in-house social worker, meaning that I would stay at the facility for 5 days, and I get 2 days off after this. My shift is Saturday to Wednesday, meaning that I can go back home Wednesday evening and return to the rehab facility Friday evening too. Now, I like to travel during evenings since there are not a lot of passengers and I can enjoy my window seat alone. The facility is located in a rural area. I can take a tricycle going through there to the bus stop, but it's too expensive for me, so I would always walk alone, and mind you, I have to pass through a wide sugarcane field before going there. There's not usually any streetlights there, but I didn't mind it. Except, well, for this one night. So just near the road was a small mum and a pop store where I would usually buy my stacks. It's like 1 kilometer away from my workplace. I go close with the owner, and she would often offer that she will ask her son-in-law to drive me to my workplace. I always politely decline her offer because I don't want to be a burden. But this time, she offered again, and I took it because when I looked down the road going to my workplace, it was really dark, and I don't know, the air felt just heavy and weird. So I finished my Pepsi and cigarette and hopped on the back of the motorcycle. When we reached the middle part, there were 5 to 7 drunken men talking in the middle of the road and saw us coming. One guy said, "Miss, come down and talk to us." I got pretty scared by that, and he came closer. The son-in-law instantly drove his motorcycle fast, and some of the men chased us while calling after me. Thank goodness, too, that they were not able to keep up. Now, if I hadn't have trusted my instincts that night, honestly, I don't know what would have happened to me. An acquaintance of mine, who happened to have been a cop, once told me this little tale that he experienced several years ago. Back then, he was a deputy and still new to the patrol scene. Since he was new to it, he got called often to more simple tasks that made the more experienced deputies' jobs easier. One night, the deputy got a request over his radio to sit on a suicide scene. The victim was still inside the home, and they needed the deputy to sit and guard the main entry to the home until the coroner got there to take the body. They didn't want any relatives or anyone else to enter the scene and mess up evidence. Basically, that was a standard procedure too. So, the deputy got to the home of the victim and confirmed with the cops already on the scene that he was there to wait for the coroner. It was the middle of the night, so the deputy grabbed his flip phone out of his patrol car and settled on the front porch to play some Snake on his phone. All was totally quiet around him after everyone else left. All the deputy could hear were the occasional sounds of distant barking dogs and the faint sounds of the sparse highway traffic. The silence did indeed make him a little bit nervous, especially considering what lied only a few feet away from him and invisible to him only because of the wall. And so, as you can imagine, it was only natural that his instincts had his ears on high alert. And he was startled when he suddenly thought that he heard a rustling sound, seemingly coming from inside the house behind him. All he could do was sit there and wait and listen intently. A few minutes went by, though, and he didn't hear anything else, so he just figured that he probably heard the house settling or something. Over half an hour went by, and the deputy was starting to get a little drowsy, staring at Snake on his small flip phone, so he flipped it shut and sat back for a few minutes to relax. But then suddenly there was that sound again, which seemed louder this time. A strange rustling sound, like maybe rustling papers, he thought to himself, puzzled. As he sat there and listened intently, he heard it again, and that time he was sure that it was coming from inside the house behind him where the victim was. At that point, the deputy admits that he was pretty scared. He didn't want to call for backup until he was sure that there was somebody inside the house, but he also didn't want to go inside the dark, creepy death scene by himself to investigate either. So he stood up and waited once again for any noise, while resting his hand on the gun in his belt. Then the deputy drew his gun as a loud sound from behind him caused him to spin around and face a large window by the front door, covered by vertical hanging blinds. As he turned around to face the window, an explosion of movement disturbed the vertical blinds. The deputy did admit to me in the telling of this story that he did in fact definitely jump and scream, as most anyone would, I suppose. The deputy's vision quickly cleared, and he stared at the face on the other side of the window, definitely not expecting to see that particular face staring back at him. The deputy screamed and went wide-eyed. The face staring back at him made a startled sound with wide-eyed as well. Then, for a quiet moment, these eyes and this officer, they stared at each other before the officer went in, and when he did, nobody was there. He called for backup after this, and they scoured that house, but nobody was there. The deputy admitted to me after telling me this story that he felt that that was one of the most scariest instances that he'd ever had in his entire career. So this happened in 2019 in Chicago when I was 27 and my ex-girlfriend was 23. And I don't remember why we ended up at McDonald's that day because she didn't like eating fast food. But what happened there still haunts me, even though there was no physical altercation or anything. It was just off is the best way to put it, and I think it's possible someone attempted to traffic her or us, and I wanted to share this to get opinions or maybe see if anyone has had a similar encounter in Chicago, because I've always had the impression that the man who approached us was in a familiar environment. So, for context, my ex is very pretty. I'm also a fairly big dude with cauliflower ears and tattoos, so men rarely approached her when we were out together. But this guy was different, and just thinking about his eyes still makes me feel a flight or fight response. We were sitting off by ourselves, doing the annoying couple thing where you both sit on the same side of the table. We were also back against a wall facing into the rest of the seating area. The McDonald's wasn't very busy that day, and this dude just kind of appeared a few feet away from our table. And even that is strange to me too, because I tend to be hyper-vigilant in public spaces because of some stuff that I've been through, but this dude was just there all of a sudden. He wasn't a particularly big man or anything, maybe a bit under 6 feet tall, I would guess. I'd say mid to late 40s and wearing business formal clothes. I remember the clothes because he was wearing a sort of burgundy dark red tie against a blue shirt, though I don't remember if he had a suit jacket on or not. But again, it was his eyes that really caught me, or us, off guard. I don't know if it was just the way that he caught us off guard, but remembering his eyes afterward was the first time that I ever questioned if the paranormal was real. They were so intense, I can still sort of see them, very blue, and he didn't blink as he sort of shifted them from her to me, then back to her. And he smirked at me before fixating on my ex. Then he stepped forward, took one of my fries, dipped it in my own ketchup, and said, "The ice cream here is good, but it's not my favorite," before putting the fry in his mouth and chewing it with a smirk not changing on his face. He didn't blink at all, mind you, just stared at my ex, chewed my fry, swallowed, kind of flicked his tongue out of his mouth, paused for a moment, then started to talk. I don't remember his words exactly, but my ex and I ran it back and forth enough times that I have a fairly good recollection of a lot of it. The first thing that he said post-fry was, "I have the ability to change your life." Then he said something about flying to Florida or driving to get milkshakes. Yeah, milkshakes. Then he said, 40,000 would change your lives, wouldn't it? I have much more than that. Then he looked at me and said something like, "I bet you'd trade something precious for $100,000. And please note that neither my ex or I had said anything at this point. I also don't think he'd blinked even once. And just the weirdness of what he talked about, as if he was trying to entice us to go with him or something. He said something about a secret room in a church on the Mile. The ex said that she thought that he might have meant the Magnificent Mile, and a high place in New York that he'd take us to. And then I declined for us. I don't even remember what I said to decline. He said something about showing us a computer that no one knows about. The ex and I both thought that we remembered him saying quantum computer, but I'm not sure. But that we wouldn't understand the future when we saw it anyway. And he just looked at her with no blinking. Then, when we didn't respond, his eyes sort of shifted to me. He looked me directly in the eye and said something that's burned into my mind. He said, "I can pay someone millions to bring her to me, or you, so you better put a ring on it." I mean, what the heck, right? Then he took another fry, dipped it, ate it, and then left the McDonald's. I'm pretty sure that he didn't blink once the entire time that we spoke to him. So, I really don't know. My ex and I had multiple discussions about whether or not the encounter really happened or if we must have just hallucinated it, but we weren't on any drugs and both of us remembered the same stuff. And something that bugs me too is that we both felt kind of, I don't know, like hypnotized or paralyzed. And that's definitely not like me. Very disconcerting. I also don't know if this dude was on drugs either, but part of what's haunting beyond the eyes, or maybe because of them too, is that his face kind of looked like a mask. Which, I don't think it was a mask, but something hit our uncanny valley, and I still wonder what would have happened if we would have left that McDonald's with him. Though, the feeling that I have is that it wouldn't have been good. Anyway, it was a really weird experience, and later on I found out that I think the person that we interacted with was actually a Chicago billionaire. His name is Kenneth Griffin, and some Redditors actually provided me with some press receipts that match details from the McDonald's conversation that I wrote about. Which is totally mind-blowing, I know. And I'm nearly certain that this was the dude that I spoke to that day. So something terrifying happened last night, and I just need to tell someone. I was sitting in my recliner last night, which is by a window, when I heard a man's voice just outside whisper, however, a very loud sort of shouting whisper as one would use to scold a child in a church or something, say, "Yo, he's still awake." I'm a strong guy, and I do have the means to protect myself, but in my vulnerable state, I felt true fear. I froze for a few seconds, then got up and looked out the window, but saw nothing. My house is in a heavily wooded area, so they could have got to the forest before I got to the window, I suppose. The blinds were closed, but not shut, so yeah, it just freaked me out. I'm going to adopt a dog today from the animal shelter I ran because I need a friend to watch my back and give me that heads up when he hears them the next time they come. However, I just want to say that it's rare that I feel every hair on my body rise in terror like that. So this happened almost 6 months ago, and I still don't understand it. My roommate occasionally has sleepovers with her boyfriend, which meant that I would stay home alone for a night or two. I never minded that, though, until that one day. I must have stayed awake until 2 a.m. studying for a test that I had the next day. Everything went as usual when I went to sleep. I looked out front door, turned off all the lights, then closed my bedroom door, turning off my light, and I fell asleep. But at some point, I suddenly woke up and my vision was very blurry. My lights were on and almost blinding me. Then I noticed my door was open and all the other lights were on too. I kept staring at my door for a few seconds, then I suddenly saw a creepy figure leaning to the side, staring back at me. It was a very tall man dressed in all black, face somehow painted black, and I couldn't tell any of his facial features other than his eyes. They were piercing, and he had sort of white, almost silver long hair falling to his knees. We just sort of stared at each other, and then I thought that I couldn't move. But then, all of a sudden, I sat up and followed him as if it was a friend of mine or a family member. I wasn't scared, I was very calm, but I stopped once I reached my bedroom's entrance. He walked to my open front door, looked at me one last time, smiled, and then left. Now, I woke up again thinking that it was just a stupid nightmare, but when I did, my lights were on. My bedroom door was open. All the lights in my house were on, and my feet, they had floor dust on them. I ran to my front door hoping that it wasn't open, and it was locked, but for some odd reason, my keys weren't attached to the lock, which is a safety measure of mine. I freaked out when I noticed I was late for my test, so I immediately dismissed whatever happened, until a few days later when I asked a friend of mine who thought that I was sleepwalking, but I never sleepwalk. I don't even talk in my sleep, and I'm still to this day terrified. I literally beg my roommate not to leave, and anytime she asks why, I just can't tell her knowing that she won't believe me. Does anyone know what that was? Does anyone have any ideas of what I should do? About a year ago, I moved my family and I to a home way out in the woods in Tennessee. Now, I wanted to be brief here, but I need to get this off my chest, and after looking into this matter a little more, I have a lot more details that I think will paint a clear picture in the end, so bear with me. The nights here can be extremely loud. Between the crickets, the tree frogs, and the cicadas, it can almost be deafening. One night not too long after we moved in, though, I had forgotten something in my car and headed outside to get it. The first thing that struck me as odd was that my dog wouldn't go outside with me. The dog always goes everywhere with me, as I'm her whole world pretty much, but for some reason, not this night. As I held the door open, she looked out and then looked up at me like, no. So I walked out and I shut the door behind me. The second night that caught me off guard was that there was not a peep. It was like dead silent. Still shrugged it off and walked down my front steps and headed down to my car. When I had gotten about 10 feet from my car, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up for some reason. I felt as though something was watching me. I looked around, but I saw nothing. After I reached in my car for what I had forgotten to grab earlier, I had this feeling like something was moving towards me. I took a step back and checked around me. All of a sudden, I heard one of the hedges next to me that lined the walkway to our front door sort of rattle a bit. At first, I thought it was just a rabbit that I had spooked, as I had seen one just earlier in the day, right where this was. A few seconds later, though, I heard the sound of a large rock, about the size of maybe a cantaloupe, landing a few feet away from me. It hit the walkway and bounced into a shrub. I instantly drew my gun and called out and said whoever that this was, they were about to be shot. After a few seconds of nothing, I began to think that maybe this was some local teenagers messing with the new people. I holstered my sidearm and turned and started walking back to my front door. Almost as soon as I turned towards my house, I heard this deep panting sound. It sounded like a huge dog, but what made me note back to my front door was that it sounded like it was right behind me. I leaped up onto my porch, turned and drew my gun, again expecting something right there, but again, there was nothing. So, a couple of weeks later, I was on my porch at night, sitting on a bench with my wife. She'd got up and walked inside to get something, and as soon as she shut the door, I heard that panting sound again. I couldn't see anything, yet this sounded like it was right on top of me almost. The sound was coming from everywhere, and it was really loud. Again, I couldn't see anything, so I just noped back inside my house. At this point, I'll admit that I was questioning moving here, but after nothing else really happening, I just sort of let it go, I suppose. A month or so later, it was a really rainy and stormy night. This was around 9 p.m, and my wife and I enjoy listening to the rain and talking about how relaxing the rain is. Me, growing up in Oregon, loved the rain, and for the past 10 years we'd lived in Vegas, where it would dump the entire year of rain in like a day and then be bone dry for like the rest of the year. For my wife, who grew up in Nevada, rain was such a rare thing that she loved going outside and watching it. So for us, this is a pretty enjoyable experience, I guess you could say. Except this night in particular, things took a really weird turn. So as we were sitting there talking about the rain and relaxing, my wife stops me and said, "Did you hear that?" I said, "No. What did you hear?" She says, "I swear it sounded like a small child calling for help out in the woods beside our house." I said, "No, I definitely didn't hear that." After a few moments of us just listening intently, she said, "There it is again." I said, I didn't hear a thing, sweetie. Are you sure you're not just hearing things?" She looked at me sort of offended that I didn't hear anything and said, "No, I'm positive. How could you not hear that? It was our son. I think he's out there and got lost." I said, "No, he's in the house sleeping on the couch." We then both looked through the blinds that were open right behind us, and we could see all of our children laying there, and she said that was so weird. I swear it sounded like our son. I said, "Well, it's definitely not him. I mean, he's right there. Besides, I really don't hear anything." She then stands up and says, "Wow, he's really crying out for help. I think I need to go and look for him." Now, at this point, if you knew my wife, you would know she is absolutely creeped out by the woods and wouldn't be caught dead walking into them during daylight, much less at night during a storm. I grabbed her hand and said, "I've been listening intently and there's absolutely nobody calling out for help. You need to stay here, okay?" At this point, I'm getting worried about her. She was acting completely out of character, not to mention that at this time she's 8 months pregnant with our baby daughter. She then says, "What if there's some child out there lost in the woods though?" I said, "Well, first off, I would be able to hear them too. Secondly, There are no other kids around here for miles, and the odds of them being lost 100 feet from our house that's lit up like a Christmas tree is like nil. She then says, I know, but what if it's a kid? Before I could say anything else, she stands up and starts walking toward the stairs. I instantly jumped up and grabbed her hand again and said, No, you're not. Get into the house. I don't know what's going on, but you need to go inside. She then complies and we both go inside. I didn't know what this was, but it freaked me out a lot. Anyway, a few months after this, just as it was getting dark outside, I heard the front door to our house open and I got up to investigate. We have autistic 6-year-old twins and we have the door set up so that they can't actually open it without us there. So to hear the sound, it could have only been my wife. What was weird though about this was the fact that she usually doesn't go outside without saying something to me. I walked out the front and saw my wife walking down our private road towards the drive on the side of our house. I ask her what she's doing and she says that she was sitting on the back patio and kept hearing a baby crying out in the woods. I said, Seriously? And you just decided to walk off into the woods to investigate? She then looks out into the woods and says, See, there it is again. Again, I can't hear anything, but what I did notice is that it was completely silent out there again. I told her, just like before, the chances of a baby being out in the woods outside of our house is slim and that she needed to get back into the house. She said, What if somebody left a baby out there though? I said, Well, if that were true, then I'd hear it too. Now, at this point, I was really starting to worry about my wife's mental health, obviously. I actually asked her to see a psychiatrist, and she did. Now, looking back, I feel really bad about this, knowing what I know. A key to this moment, though, was that my wife had just given birth to her baby girl maybe a month before. A few days after this, though, we were out on the front porch. It's early evening, and I had just mowed the lawn this day, and our 3-year-old son was riding around in his little car in front of the house. He knows that he's not allowed outside of a certain area that we mapped off. He loves playing outside, but with the road behind 50 feet of our front porch, we have to be careful as a lot of boaters will fly through after drinking all day on their boats. As we're talking, we're both sort of keeping an eye on him. A neighbor drives by and stops to say hi for a second. This interaction must have taken like 8 seconds, as all they said was, How are things? We said good, and he told us that he would stop by later as his wife got something for the kids, who happens to be one of their teachers in a school. And we said, Oh, okay, and he drove off. I looked over to where our son was, and he was gone. I called out his name and ran over to the side of the house and could hear his car on the other side of the drive. I scolded him for leaving the area, and he said something in his 3-year-old gibberish and pointed to the woods behind our house. I said, though, that he had 5 seconds to get back to the front of the house or else. And he adamantly pointed back in the direction of the woods and kept trying to tell me something. I looked off in the direction of the woods and just assumed that he'd seen a deer or a squirrel or something, and maybe that he wanted to see it up close or something. I walked back up to the front of the house and he cried the whole way there. He got really upset, in fact, that I wouldn't let him go into the woods, but I just wrote this off as him being curious, and most 3-year-old boys are, right? Now, this instance isn't isolated, as our twins have done similar things, but nothing quite as extreme as this, I guess. There have also been nights, though, where we had just laid down for the night and had heard a loud bang on the side of our house on the wall behind our bed. It was so loud that I jumped up and looked out the window. Our floodlight came on too, but I couldn't see anything. Now, the weird part about this is that our bedroom sits about 12 feet from the ground level, as we have a full-size basement that's cinder block. I put on my slippers and grabbed one of my 12-gauge shotguns and walked outside to investigate. And it was completely dead silent again. The floodlight that's on the side of the house had clicked off at this point, so I walked over to the end of the deck and shined my light around the yard. There was nothing. I walked around the house and shined the light around intently. As I approached the back side of my house, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up again. It felt like someone was watching me again. I shined the light up into the trees, but again, nothing. I rounded the corner, and the first thing that I noticed was that my 3 dogs were in that area, and they weren't making a peep. Our dogs have no filter and will bark at anyone and everything. This includes me. So to see them all hiding with their tails between their legs, not making a peep, really had me worried. As I kept walking, all of a sudden the crickets and the frogs started making sounds again. It was as if someone had clicked a switch almost. Like it was completely silent and then all of a sudden it was just alive again. I walked back into the house and I told my wife that I hadn't seen anything. She shrugged and said, okay, as long as our dogs were okay. Due to the circumstances that night, I decided to let the dogs in and sleep with us. This very same thing has happened in all 4 exterior walls of our house too. It's random and annoying, but just like this instance, every time, there is nothing going on outside. There have also been times where we were sitting in the house and as I was watching a movie, my wife walked over to me and said, "Did you call me?" I said no, and she said that she swears that she heard me call her name in her ear. She said that it was definitely my voice and she didn't understand because it sounded so close and I was a good 20 feet away from her in my recliner. The important part to this too was that she was sitting at the table doing something and the slider to the backyard was open behind her. Now, our back patio sits about 20 feet off the ground and is like a sort of balcony as it has no stair access outside. I think the previous owner must have built it for barbecuing or something. There have been several instances though where she would say that she heard someone whisper in her ear, but she couldn't make out the sound. Again, I kept thinking that she was just going crazy, but as you'll see, I think all of this is tied into this final moment where things are revealed. So the last thing that I want to mention before we get into what just happened is that I have a shooting range built behind my workshop on the opposite side of our property next to the main road. It's kind of on a downslope, but it works perfectly for what I need for it. The range itself is cut straight into the woods going down about 100 yards or so. When you're at the downrange, you have woods surrounding you on all sides, except back up to my shop. I have to say that it's always felt creepy when I'm dealing with my targets or mowing there. When you're down there, it feels like you're miles from anyone pretty much. And one day, around 5 in the evening, I was sighting in a new rifle scope. The sun was still up, but was going to start to fade soon, so I knew this was going to be my final test. Up until this point, nothing really happened while I was making my multiple trips down the range, other than this feeling of uneasiness, I guess. But as I got down the range, I kept getting this feeling like someone or something was watching me again. I looked around, but didn't see anything. As I was placing stickers over my previous shots, I heard something big off to the side of me. It sounded like a large branch had snapped off a tree or something. If you've been in Tennessee woods, then you'll know that a lot of branches fall off trees randomly out of pretty much nowhere, so this was nothing new. Except this time, it was really loud and sounded like fresh, strong wood, if that makes any sense. I turned and looked, but again couldn't see anything. I started walking back up to my rifle, and I swear that I heard something right behind me. I turned around, but again I saw nothing. As I started to walk again, I heard this deep growl. It was really deep and loud, and what's worse is that it was all around me. I turned around facing the range and started walking backwards. The thought of some rabid dog charging out of the bushes had freaked me out, so running wasn't a good idea. I slowly walked backwards up the hill to my rifle, but again, nothing happened. I grabbed my rifle and sprayed the target with rapid fire, hoping to scare off whatever was stalking me. I left 10 rounds in the mag and grabbed my rifle bag and quickly walked back up to the house. I never did tell my wife about this, as I didn't want to freak her out. So, fast forward to about a year later from when we moved in, and my niece is staying with us in a living-in nanny to earn money over summer break from college. We were on our way back from the store and about a mile from our house, and I saw two eyes reflecting in the headlights coming from a wide tree on the side of the road just ahead. It had caught my attention because they were higher than a deer, but a different color and size. And just as I had said, "What is that?" and squinted, they vanished. I had made a comment that it was almost as if it had known that I could see its eyes and sort of moved. The color was kind of a golden green, but they resembled the mannerism of a large cat, as they felt sort of ominous, I guess. It's hard to explain, but I shrugged it off as we were passing the tree and saw nothing. A few moments later, we arrived at the house. As we were getting bags out of the car, my 3-year-old son came bolting out of the house excited to see me. As I was waiting to help carry in some of the bags, I all of a sudden heard my dog growl. I looked in the direction that she was looking, at my neighbor's property across the street, and what I saw has kept me up all night. Up until this point, I'd always been skeptical, as I'd never seen anything with my own 2 eyes. Even with what had happened to me the year prior, I still had my doubts that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Now, my street is kind of a spread out neighborhood. Each house sort of sits on several acres, and at the end of our road is a Kentucky lake. My neighbor's house sits adjacent to my house on about an acre lot. Directly in front of my house is a wall of woods, and directly behind my house is several thousand acres of untouched forest. As I was looking across the street to my neighbor's property, I saw a large dark figure between the trees at first. The movement caught me off guard, as it sort of looked like something big moving quickly on all fours. Then, when it came out into clear view, it stood up and it walked just like a man. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. It was very tall, but what was strange about it was the distance it was covering, and the fact that when it was in front of the shed, I swear that I could see through it. It was clearly walking quickly, but moving faster than any person could at a sprint. And more importantly, there was absolutely no sound. It was like it was sort of phasing in and out of reality as it moved. I said, "What the heck is that?" and realized that it was looking directly at us. It moved at an angle away from us so as to minimize its time out in the open, and moving quickly as it could while still being silent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that whatever it was stalking us. I told my niece to get into the house now. I grabbed my son and we booked it inside. I grabbed my AR-15 with a short scope and came back outside to see my niece still grabbing stuff out of her car. Knowing that I told her firmly and clearly to get into the house, her disregard to my command really annoyed me at the time. But still, I watched over her without saying a word. As she was slowly walking, she turned towards the woods across the street from my house and suddenly bolted for the house. She ran up the steps in a sort of panic state. I asked her what she saw, and her face was pale as a ghost. She said, "I heard something big in the woods walking loudly on the leaves, and when I turned toward it, I heard a deep sort of guttural growl." I asked her why she didn't come in when I told her, and she said that she thought that I was talking to my son. I told her what I had seen, and she wanted to get a closer look to see if she could see something too. I told her that that was not a good idea, and she went anyway. As she was walking down the walkway, I heard the sound of dry leaves crunching in the woods across the street. I told her to stop and come take the flashlight. Now, at this point, she's about 6 feet away from my wife's SUV. As she turned and started walking back to me, I caught a glimpse of something grey and hairy bolt from behind the SUV back across the street into the woods. My porch is a raised porch, like I said, and our SUV is about 6.5 feet tall. Whatever it was, it cleared about 45 feet in what looked like a single leap. It moved like lightning, like nothing I'd ever seen. Whatever it was, it wanted my niece. It jumped behind the car out of my line of sight and was waiting for her. She still doubted my warnings and grabbed the flashlight and walked back toward the car. And as she entered my driveway, she stopped dead in her tracks and leaned forward as if she could see something. I asked her what she saw, and she turned and ran back up on the porch with a terrified look on her face, saying no just over and over again. She said that it was a figure hiding inside of a tree and that what she saw was its eyes. I asked her what they looked like, and all she could say was that they looked dull red at first, but as she got closer, they looked sort of dead. I said, "What do you mean dead?" And she said that they were pupils that looked grey, like the way eyes look when they go blind sort of thing. She said that it was really dark grey, and she says that she could see through it, almost like a dark cloud. She said that she wanted to go out again, and she took a step down the stairs, and as she did it, it revealed itself from the tree. I said get inside, and I went in and locked the door, and this time I got a pretty good look at it. And it looked like what I said, but tall and sort of human-shaped too. It was really tall, in fact, and man, it was ominous. It took off after this, and after that, we didn't see anything again. Obviously, we didn't sleep that night. We just sat around talking about it for hours, but the next morning we did a height comparison to the tree limb that she saw it stand over, and it put its height to around 9 feet tall, and its eyes were about 6 inches apart. At this point, I don't know what this thing was, but after doing some research, I think that maybe this thing is called a glimmerman or a crawler, as some put it. I looked to see if there had been any other sightings in the Benton County, but there's nothing. More importantly, though, I swear that it would phase in and out, almost like a shadow person, but bigger and more obvious. One of the things, though, that really stuck out to me is that this thing seems to be able to communicate telepathically, and this explains why everyone was hearing something that nobody else could hear. It also seems to have sort of like a playback-like communication. So when I heard a dog panting, it was probably one of my dogs that it had heard. Well, I would guess at least. And the baby crying would have been our newborn baby who she had given birth to just recently. And maybe it had heard me call my wife's name and kept telepathically calling my wife's name with my voice or something. Another thing that my niece had said too that night was that she felt really compelled to go back outside to it. She said that she felt like this thing was communicating with her somehow and it wanted her to go back outside. But the more I read about this, the more everything that's been happening over this past year makes a lot of sense too. One thing that I find extra convincing too is that down the road towards the lake, there's a property that is barbed wired off and is a sort of wall of forest with no driveway. A lot of the property down our road is undeveloped owned land, and one of the trees there, it has a large old sign that says, "Screamer lives here," with an arrow pointing back into the woods. Now, I have to admit that when I first saw this sign, I laughed at it, thinking maybe the owner screamed at trespassers who entered his property or something, and teenagers put up the sign to mess with him. But when I did a satellite search of our neighborhood, that entire section of road has no houses or trails or anything, and is just pure forest for as far as the eye can see. One of the things that this thing is said to do is make a loud scream when threatened. And apparently, one of the things that this thing is said to do is make a loud scream when threatened. Now that you understand my story, I doubt that this is the ending too. But the next question is, what can we do? I don't want my wife or kids to disappear one day, and if there is more than one of these things out there, this really makes the missing 411 make a whole lot of sense. I feel really perplexed and scared as to what I can do. If you guys have any advice, then I would love to hear it. I'll try and share any more information if anything else happens, but that's pretty much everything for now. This happened over a span of many months, and like I said, we've been living here for some time, and things have gotten worse, but I just really don't know what to do.